September 1260. The plains south of Galilee shimmer in the late summer heat. A Mongol army stands at the edge of a dusty field near a cluster of springs the locals call Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath. They've ridden west from the ruins of Baghdad, from the ashes of 100 cities, from the graves of empires that tried to stop them and failed. For 4 decades, no force on earth has successfully challenged Mongol military supremacy on open ground. Not the Jin dynasty with its walled cities and millions of soldiers, not the Khwarezmian Empire at the height of its power, not the coalition armies of Europe at Liegnitz, not the Caliphate itself, which fell in a single campaign season. The commander on the field is Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian general who burned Damascus and took Aleppo without serious resistance. His force numbers perhaps 15 to 20,000, small by Mongol standards, but more than sufficient for what they've accomplished so far in Syria. Across from him, a Mamluk army has formed ranks. These are slave soldiers from Egypt, men purchased as boys from the Caucasus and the steppes, trained in Cairo's barracks, and now fielded under commanders who rose through the same system. Their Sultan Kutuz stands with them. He knows what everyone knows: the Mongols don't lose. But something breaks on this field. The Mongol centre, which has never failed to execute the feigned retreat, which has pulled enemy armies into kill zones from China to Poland, attempts the manoeuvre and finds itself genuinely pressed. The Mamluk heavy cavalry, trained in the same composite bow and close combat tactics that make the Mongols lethal, refuses to overcommit. When the Mongol wings attempt to envelop, they meet not a panicked mob but disciplined reserves that shift to meet the threat. The battle becomes a grinding engagement of cavalry against cavalry, bow against bow, with neither side able to gain the decisive positional advantage that Mongol doctrine requires. By day's end, Kitbuka is dead. The Mongol force retreats, and for the first time in the Western campaigns, they do not return to reclaim the field. This is not the story of a miracle. It's not about a single tactical genius or an unexpected weapon. What stopped the Mongols at Ain Jalut was something more fundamental, something that had been built methodically in Egypt over the previous decade while the Mongol storm moved west. The Mamluks didn't defeat the Mongols because they fought harder or wanted it more. They defeated them because they had constructed a military system specifically designed to counter Mongol operational methods, and because that system was fed, trained, and deployed through a logistical and institutional framework that could sustain professional cavalry warfare at scale. But to understand how that system came to exist, you have to go back 13 years to the catastrophe that taught the Islamic world exactly what it was facing. 1247, the eastern frontier of the Islamic world. The Mongol Empire has already shattered the Jin dynasty and conquered northern China. Genghis Khan is dead, but his sons and grandsons continue the expansion. Ugadai Khan has completed the conquest of the Khwarezmian territories, and now Mongol Tumans, units of 10,000 cavalry, range across Persia and the Caucasus, testing the edges of the Caliphate's sphere. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, nearly 5 centuries old, still holds symbolic authority over the Sunni Islamic world. It's weakened, fragmented, no longer the administrative colossus it was under Harun al-Rashid, but it remains the centre of Islamic legitimacy and culture. The Mongols don't care about legitimacy, they care about submission and tribute. When the Abbasid Caliph refuses to acknowledge Mongol supremacy, he sets in motion a confrontation that will define the limits of Islamic resistance for a generation. In 1256, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, crosses the Oxus River with an army estimated between 120,000 and 150,000 soldiers, not all Mongol, but all operating under Mongol command structure and tactical doctrine. His objective is the complete subjugation of Persia and Mesopotamia. First, he moves against the Assassins, the Nizari Ismaili sect that holds a network of mountain fortresses across northern Persia. These fortresses are considered impregnable. Some have never fallen to siege. The Mongols take them in sequence, methodically, using siege engines built by Chinese and Persian engineers, cutting supply lines, and refusing to leave until each fortress capitulates or starves. The assassin leadership surrenders in 1257. Hulagu executes them and dismantles their strongholds stone by stone. Then he turns toward Baghdad. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, appears to believe that his religious authority and the city's reputation will deter a direct assault. He does not mobilize the full resources of Mesopotamia. He does not call for a united defense or consolidate regional armies. When Hulagu's forces arrive outside Baghdad in January 1258, the Caliph's army attempts a sortie and is routed immediately. The Mongols encircle the city, breach the walls with siege engines and pour into the streets. What follows is one of the most catastrophic urban destructions in medieval history. The Mongols spend a week systematically killing the population. Estimates of the dead range from tens of thousands to perhaps 250,000. The numbers are uncertain, but the scale is not. The House of Wisdom, repository of centuries of Islamic and pre-Islamic scholarship, is destroyed. The Caliph himself is executed, reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses to avoid spilling royal blood directly. The Caliphate, the institution that has stood since the 7th century, ceases to exist as a political entity. The psychological impact across the Islamic world is immediate and total. If Baghdad can fall, if the Caliph himself can be killed, then no city, no ruler, no army is safe. The Mongols are not raiders who can be bought off or negotiated with. They are an exterminating force, and they are coming west. Damascus opens its gates without resistance in 1260. Aleppo burns. The Mongol army splits, sending detachments south toward Egypt and west toward the remnants of the Crusader states. Hulagu himself returns east, recalled by political struggles within the Mongol Empire after the death of the great Khan Mongke. He leaves Kitbuka in command of the occupation force in Syria, with orders to secure the region and prepare for the conquest of Egypt. This is the force, reduced but still lethal, that will meet the Mamluks at Ain Jalut. But the Mamluks are not the Caliphate. They are not a traditional Islamic dynasty or a tribal confederation. They are something new, something purpose-built, and their origins lie in a strategic decision made decades earlier by a dynasty that understood it needed soldiers who could fight the kind of war that was coming. Cairo, 1250. The Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin a century earlier, is collapsing from within. The last effective sultan, Al-Saleh Ayyub, has just died during the 7th Crusade while French forces under Louis IX occupy the Nile Delta. His widow, Shajar al-Dur, conceals his death to prevent panic, and the army that marches to meet the Crusaders is commanded not by a prince of the royal blood, but by Mamluk officers who rose through the military ranks. They defeat Louis at the Battle of Al-Mansura, capture him, and extract a massive ransom. When the deception about the Sultan's death can no longer be maintained, it is the Mamluks themselves who seize power. The word Mamluk means owned or property. These are men who began as slaves, purchased as boys, usually between 8 and 12 years old, from the Caucasus, the Central Asian steppes, and the Black Sea region. The Ayyubids bought them deliberately from these sources because they wanted soldiers with no local ties, no tribal loyalties, no family networks that might compromise their allegiance to the state. A Kipchak Turk or Circassian boy brought to Cairo has no clan to return to, no rival dynasty to serve. His only path to status and survival runs through the barracks and the battlefield. The training system is brutal and comprehensive. The boys are housed in the citadel of Cairo, isolated from the city, and subjected to years of military education. They learn to ride in the Turkic style, managing the horse with legs and body, while leaving both hands free for the composite bow. They drill in archery until they can loose arrows accurately at full gallop. They train with the lance and sabre, practice formation riding, study the Quran and basic literacy, and absorb a military culture that prioritizes discipline and unit cohesion over individual glory. By the time they complete training and are formally manumitted, freed from slavery, they are professional cavalrymen with no civilian skills and no life outside the military hierarchy. This is not feudal levies or tribal warriors who return to their herds between campaigns. This is a standing professional army, maintained year-round, trained to a standard that rivals or exceeds the Mongol system itself. The Mamluks are not better individual riders or archers than the Mongol, that would be nearly impossible, but they are trained in the same essential skills, and they operate within a command structure that can sustain prolonged campaigns without relying on pasture, plunder, or seasonal migration. When the Mamluks take power in 1250, they inherit Egypt's agricultural wealth, the most productive and reliable revenue base in the eastern Mediterranean. The Nile Delta floods on schedule, the irrigation systems function, the tax apparatus collects grain and coin with reasonable efficiency. This gives the Mamluk state something the Mongols do not have in their western campaigns, a logistical foundation that doesn't depend on mobility and raiding. The Mamluks can afford to maintain large cavalry forces in barracks, to stockpile fodder and weapons, to keep units in the field for months without dispersing to graze herds across hundreds of miles of steppe. But wealth and training are not enough, not against an enemy that has destroyed every army it has faced for 40 years. The Mamluks know this because they've seen the reports from the east. They've interrogated refugees from Baghdad and Aleppo, and they understand exactly what Mongol military doctrine does to conventional Islamic armies. The Mongol system, refined over decades of conquest, is built on speed, deception, and operational maneuver. A Mongol two-man moves faster than almost any opponent can react. Scouts range ahead and on the flanks, gathering intelligence through a relay system that can transmit information across hundreds of miles in days. The main force avoids frontal assaults whenever possible, instead using feigned retreats to draw enemy armies out of position, then enveloping them with wings that have remained hidden or appeared to be in flight. The composite bow, effective at ranges up to 200 meters or more, allows Mongol cavalry to inflict casualties while staying outside the reach of slower, heavier cavalry or infantry. When an enemy army is disrupted, disorganized or pinned, the Mongols close for melee and destroy it completely. This operational style has broken Chinese infantry armies, Persian cavalry, Hungarian knights, and Russian princes. It works because most opponents either lack the mobility to counter it or lack the discipline to avoid the traps. Tribal confederations pursue too eagerly and get enveloped. Feudal armies form static defensive positions and get bypassed or starved out. Infantry-heavy forces can't catch Mongol cavalry in the open field and get worn down by archery before the Mongols close to finish them. The Mamluks, studying this record, recognize that they cannot fight the Mongols the way Baghdad fought them. They cannot rely on city walls alone. The Mongols have siege engineers and the patience to starve out or breach any fortification. They cannot expect to win through numerical superiority. The Mongols have defeated larger forces repeatedly by concentrating at the decisive point and destroying armies piecemeal, and they cannot assume that courage or religious fervour will carry the day because the Mongols are not demoralised by fanaticism and do not break under pressure the way less disciplined armies do. What the Mamluks need is a force that can match Mongol mobility and sustain Mongol-style cavalry warfare long enough to deny the Mongols their operational advantages. They need cavalry that won't shatter under the feigned retreat, that can execute its own manoeuvres without losing cohesion, and that can fight effectively with both bow and blade in prolonged engagements. They need, in other words, to become what the Mongols are: fast, professional and operationally flexible, while maintaining the logistical base that allows them to fight close to their own supply lines. Between 1250 and 1260, the Mamluk state systematically builds this capability. Sultan Qutuz, who takes power in 1259, expands the training barracks, increases the purchase of slave recruits, and ensures that units remain drilled and ready even in peacetime. Baybars, the general who will command the Mamluk vanguard at Jalut and later become Sultan himself, oversees field training that emphasizes coordinated maneuvers and disciplined responses to enemy feints. The Mamluks practice the same tactics the Mongols use: feigned retreats, envelopments, archery barrages from mobile platforms. They drill until the responses are automatic, until a unit can execute a tactical withdrawal under fire without degenerating into a rout. Crucially, the Mamluks also solve the intelligence problem. When Hulagu's forces advance into Syria and then withdraw east, leaving Kitbuka to occupy the region, the Mamluks do not wait passively in Egypt. They send scouts and envoys into Syria, gathering information on Mongol dispositions, supply lines and troop strengths. They learn that Kitbuka's force is smaller than the army Hulagu commanded, that the Mongols are dispersed across Syria in garrison positions, and that the occupation is not yet consolidated. They learn, most importantly, that the Mongols are vulnerable to being caught before they can concentrate their full strength. In the summer of 1260, the Mamluks march north. This is not a reactive scramble or a desperate defence. This is a calculated offensive, launched at a moment when the Mamluks believe they have a realistic chance of forcing a decisive battle under favourable conditions. Qutuz moves with an army of perhaps 12 to 15,000 cavalry, not a massive force, but large enough to contest control of the field and composed entirely of trained professional soldiers who have spent a decade preparing for exactly this kind of fight. The Mongols, for their part, are confident. They have no reason not to be. Kitbuka has defeated every Syrian force that opposed him. He has taken fortified cities with minimal resistance. He He has seen enemy armies collapse at the first sign of Mongol maneuver. When his scouts report that a Mamluk army is approaching from the south, he does not retreat or call for reinforcements. He advances to meet them, expecting another victory to add to the long list of Mongol triumphs. This expectation, built on 40 years of unbroken success, is about to collide with a military system designed specifically to deny the Mongols the conditions they need to win. The armies meet near Jalut on September 3rd, 1260. The location is not accidental. The Mamluks have manoeuvred deliberately to force the engagement here, in terrain they've scouted and on ground that doesn't favour the sweeping encirclements the Mongols prefer. The field is constricted by hills and vegetation, not the wide open steppe where Mongol cavalry can operate at maximum range and speed. This matters more than it might seem. The Mongols excel at fluid, long-range manoeuvre warfare, compress the battlefield, reduce the space for wide flanking movements, and you begin to neutralise one of their key advantages. Kitbuka deploys his force in the standard Mongol formation, a centre strong enough to absorb initial contact, wings positioned to envelop once the enemy commits, and a reserve ready to exploit any breakthrough or pursue a rout. His soldiers are experienced, disciplined, and accustomed to winning. Many of them are veterans of the campaigns in Persia and Iraq. They've faced larger armies than this and shattered them. The Mamluk deployment mirrors the Mongol formation in structure but not in intent. Kutuz places Baybars in command of the vanguard, the forward element that will make first contact. The main body and reserves are held back, positioned to respond to Mongol maneuvers rather than commit immediately. This is a defensive-offensive posture. The Mamluks are willing to strike first, but they're not going to charge headlong into a Mongol formation and give Kitbuka the disrupted, overextended enemy he needs. The battle opens with archery. Both sides employ composite bows, both sides can shoot accurately from horseback, and both sides understand that the opening phase of a cavalry engagement is about inflicting casualties and testing enemy cohesion before committing to close combat. The Mamluk vanguard advances, looses volleys, and then begins to withdraw. This is the moment that has broken so many armies. The Mongols pursue, applying pressure, expecting the Mamluk withdrawal to accelerate into panic. The Mamluk cavalry falls back in stages, units covering each other, maintaining formation. The Mongols recognize this as a fighting retreat, not a rout, but they press anyway. Mongol doctrine is flexible. If the feigned retreat isn't working, you adapt, apply more pressure, try to isolate and destroy segments of the enemy force. Kitbuka's wings begin to move, attempting to get around the Mamluk flanks and create the envelopment that has worked from Khwarezm to Hungary. And here, the Mamluk system shows its purpose. The reserves, held back under Kutuz's direct control, shift to meet the Mongol wings. They don't charge wildly or commit prematurely. They move into blocking positions, presenting a formed, cohesive line that the Mongol cavalry cannot simply brush aside. The Mongols find themselves engaged not with a panicked mob, but with units that fight in formation, that maintain discipline under pressure, and that can execute coordinated movements without collapsing. The engagement becomes attritional. Both sides are taking casualties. The Mongols are not accustomed to this kind of prolonged, indecisive cavalry battle. Their strength lies in creating breakthroughs, in exploiting enemy mistakes, in turning a tactical advantage into a complete rout. But the Mamluks aren't giving them that opportunity. Every time a Mongol unit pushes forward, it meets resistance that forces it to either commit fully or pull back. The Mamluk cavalry fights with the bow at range and the sabre in close combat, matching Mongol capabilities without offering the tactical openings that Mongol commanders are trained to exploit. Baybars, commanding the Mamluk vanguard, executes a counterattack in the centre. This is not a reckless charge, but a calculated push designed to disrupt the Mongol formation and prevent Kitbuka from stabilising his line. The Mamluk heavy cavalry, armed and armoured for shock action, hits the Mongol centre with enough force to stagger it. The Mongols don't break, they're too experienced for that, but they're forced to pull back and regroup. Kitbuka commits his reserve, trying to restore momentum. This is the decision point. If the Mamluks falter now, if they lose cohesion or fail to maintain pressure, the Mongols can still turn the battle. But the Mamluk formations hold. The reserve units that Kutuz has kept back move forward, not in a desperate rush, but in a controlled advance that keeps the pressure on the Mongol line. The battlefield, constricted by terrain, does not allow the Mongols to disengage cleanly and reposition. They're locked into a grinding engagement, the kind of fight where numbers, stamina and morale matter as much as tactical brilliance. The Mongol wings, unable to complete the envelopment, begin to show signs of strain. Casualties are mounting. The Mamluk cavalry, fighting close to their own supply lines and drawing on fresh remounts from reserves, maintains combat effectiveness. The Mongols, operating at the end of a long logistical chain and without immediate reinforcements, begin to lose cohesion. Kitbuka himself fights in the front ranks, trying to rally his soldiers and restore the initiative. This is not unusual. Mongol commanders lead from the front and share the risks of battle. But it exposes him to direct combat, and in the chaos of the melee, he is killed. The exact circumstances are uncertain. Whether he falls to a Mamluk warrior in single combat or is overwhelmed by multiple attackers, but the result is immediate. With their commander dead and the battle stalemated, the Mongol force begins to withdraw. This is the moment when most armies throughout history have disintegrated. A withdrawal under pressure, especially after the loss of a commanding general, usually turns into a rout. The Mongols manage to pull back in something resembling order, which speaks to their training and discipline, but they cannot hold the field. The Mamluks pursue, but not recklessly. They've won the engagement and they're not going to throw away their victory by overextending into a counterattack. The Mongol retreat continues north into Syria. The Mamluks follow, but cautiously, taking towns and fortresses that the Mongols abandon. There are skirmishes, rearguard actions, but no second major battle. The Mongols withdraw across the Euphrates, back into the territories Hulagu controls directly, and they do not return to contest Syria. This is the first time in 40 years that a Mongol field army has been decisively defeated in open battle and failed to reassert control of the region. It is not the end of the Mongol Empire. Hulagu still rules Persia. The Ilkhanate will endure for decades, and Mongol power remains dominant across Asia. But it is the end of Mongol expansion into the Levant and Egypt. The frontier stabilizes. The Mamluks consolidate control over Syria and establish a defensive perimeter that the Mongols will probe but never break. The question is why? What happened at Ain Jalut that didn't happen at Liegnitz, at the Kalka River, at the fall of Baghdad? The answer is not that the Mamluks fought harder or had superior morale. The Mongols had faced brave, determined enemies before and destroyed them. The answer is not that the Mamluks had some secret weapon or tactical innovation that the Mongols couldn't counter. The composite bow, the cavalry tactics, the basic operational methods were similar on both sides. The answer lies in structure, in logistics, and in the nature of the military system the Mamluks had built. To understand why that system worked when so many others failed, you have to understand what made the Mongol military machine so effective in the first place, and what conditions it actually required to function at full strength. The Mongol military system at its peak is not just an army. It's a social and economic structure built around the horse, the bow, and the capacity to move an entire society across vast distances. Every Mongol warrior is a horseman from childhood, raised in a culture where riding and archery are survival skills, not specialized military training. A Mongol on campaign brings multiple horses, typically 3 to 5 remounts per rider, which allows the army to cover distances that would exhaust any other cavalry force. When one horse tires, the rider switches to a fresh mount. This extends operational range and maintains speed over weeks of continuous movement. The Mongol composite bow is a technological marvel, constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew that store enormous energy in a compact frame. It can penetrate armor at close range and harass enemies effectively at distances beyond what most opponents can match. More importantly, Mongol warriors train with this weapon from early childhood. By the time they join a campaign, they can shoot accurately from horseback at full gallop, loosing arrows in rapid succession while managing the reins with their legs. This is not a skill you can teach in a barracks over a few years. It requires a lifetime of practice embedded in a pastoral nomadic culture. The organizational structure is decimal and ruthlessly efficient. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Orders flow down the chain with clarity, and every soldier knows his place in the formation. Discipline is maintained through collective responsibility. If one man deserts or fails, his entire unit faces punishment. This creates powerful incentives for mutual accountability and cohesion under pressure. The communication system uses mounted couriers and relay stations that can transmit messages across the empire faster than any contemporary state. Intelligence gathering is systematic. Scouts move ahead of the main army. Local populations are interrogated or coerced into providing information, and commanders receive detailed reports on enemy positions, terrain, and resources before committing to battle. But all of this power comes with constraints that are easy to overlook when you're watching the Mongols destroy sedentary empires. The Mongol army is mobile, but it is not self-sufficient in the way a logistically supported force can be. It depends on pasture. Those 3 to 5 horses per rider need to graze, and they need vast amounts of grass. A Mongol tumen of 10,000 riders with 40 to 50,000 horses requires enormous grazing land. In the steppes, this is manageable. The army moves continuously, following seasonal pastures, and the horses find what they need. In agricultural regions with dense populations and cultivated fields, the problem becomes acute. When the Mongols invade northern China, Persia, or Eastern Europe, they often campaign during seasons when pasture is available, and withdraw when it is not. They can sustain short, devastating raids into agricultural heartlands, but prolonged occupation requires either dispersing the army to find grazing, which reduces combat effectiveness, or establishing supply lines to bring in fodder, which the Mongols are not traditionally equipped to manage. The Mongol solution in many conquered territories is to destroy agricultural infrastructure and depopulate regions to create artificial pasture. This works for maintaining long-term control but makes it harder to extract wealth from the territory or govern settled populations. The second constraint is that the Mongol system is built for offensive warfare and strategic mobility, not for static defense or prolonged positional engagements. A Mongol army achieves its greatest effectiveness when it can choose the time and place of battle, when it can use reconnaissance to identify enemy weaknesses, and when it can maneuver freely to create envelopments and exploit breakthroughs. Lock a Mongol force into a grinding attritional engagement where mobility doesn't provide a decisive advantage, and you neutralize much of what makes them superior. This is what the Mamluks understood, consciously or not, when they built their system. They could not out-Mongol the Mongols in terms of pure steppe warfare. Mamluk recruits, even those from Turkic or Kipchak backgrounds, did not grow up riding and shooting from infancy in the same way Mongol children did. But the Mamluks could create a professional cavalry force that was good enough in the essential skills, mounted archery, formation riding, tactical maneuver, while maintaining a logistical base that allowed them to sustain operations without depending on pasture or plunder. Egypt's agricultural surplus, concentrated along the Nile, provides the revenue to purchase horses, weapons, and recruits year after year. The state maintains granaries and fodder supplies that can support cavalry units in barracks and on campaign without requiring them to disperse for grazing. This means the Mamluk army can stay concentrated, can train as formed units, and can deploy quickly without the logistical constraints that force steppe armies to move constantly in search of pasture. The Mamluk training system, for all its brutality, produces soldiers who have no life outside the military hierarchy. A Mongol warrior has a family, herds, a place in the tribal structure. He fights for plunder, for glory, for the collective success of the confederation, but he also has obligations and ties that pull him away from campaign. A Mamluk has none of this. He is fed, housed, and paid by the state. His entire identity is bound to his unit and his position in the military hierarchy. This creates a level of professional focus and discipline that is difficult to achieve in armies that draw on militia levies or feudal contingents. When Kutuz marches north to face Kitbuka, he does so with an army that has been drilling together for years, that operates under a unified command structure, and that is supplied from a logistical base that does not depend on finding forage in hostile territory. The Mongols, by contrast, are operating at the far edge of their strategic reach. Hulagu has withdrawn to Persia. Kitbuka commands a detachment, not the full Mongol force that conquered Baghdad. His supply lines run back through Syria and Iraq, regions that have been devastated by the conquest, and do not provide the resources to support a prolonged campaign. This imbalance does not guarantee a Mamluk victory, but it creates conditions where the Mongols cannot leverage their full advantages. They cannot maneuver freely across unlimited space. They cannot afford a prolonged campaign of attrition. They cannot disperse to graze their horses without losing concentration. And they are facing an enemy that has specifically trained to counter their tactical methods. An enemy that will not panic under the feigned retreat, that can match their mobility well enough to avoid envelopment, and that can sustain combat effectiveness in a grinding engagement. At Ain Jalut, all of these factors converge. The battlefield is constricted, limiting Mongol maneuver. The Mamluks maintain discipline under pressure, denying the Mongols the tactical breakthroughs they rely on. The engagement becomes attritional, and the Mamluks, fighting close to their supply lines and drawing on concentrated reserves, can sustain the fight longer than the Mongols can. When Kitbuka falls and the Mongol force withdraws, they do not have the strategic depth or the logistical capacity to regroup and counterattack. They retreat, and the Mamluks consolidate control. This is not a story about heroism overcoming impossible odds, it is a story about structure and preparation. The Mamluks did not defeat the Mongols because they were braver or more skilled. They defeated them because they built a military system that could operate effectively against Mongol doctrine, and because they fought the battle under conditions that minimized Mongol advantages and maximized their own. But the victory at Jalut is only the beginning. Winning a single battle does not end a war, and it certainly does not end the threat of Mongol invasion. The Mamluks now face the question of how to hold what they have won, how to prevent the Mongols from returning with overwhelming force, and how to consolidate their control over a region that has been ravaged by decades of warfare. The immediate aftermath of Jalut is not triumphant celebration, but urgent consolidation. Kutuz knows that he has defeated a Mongol expeditionary force, not the full strength of the Ilkhanate. Hulagu still commands a massive army in Persia, and if he chooses to return west with that force, the Mamluks will face a far more dangerous fight than the one they just won. The window for securing Syria is narrow, measured in months, perhaps weeks, before the Mongols can react. The Mamluk army moves north into Syria, taking control of cities that had submitted to Mongol authority. Damascus, which opened its gates to Kitbuka without resistance, now submits to the Mamluks. Aleppo, partially destroyed during the Mongol conquest, comes under Mamluk administration. The local populations, traumatized by years of warfare and occupation, are less concerned with which power rules them than with whether that power can provide stability and protection. The Mamluks offer both, backed by the demonstrated ability to defeat Mongol forces in open battle. But Kutuz does not survive long enough to consolidate his victory. On the march back to Egypt, less than a month after Jalut, he's assassinated by a conspiracy of Mamluk officers that includes Baybars. The exact motives are murky: personal rivalry, disputes over spoils, political ambition. But the result is immediate. Baybars seizes power, declares himself sultan, and begins the process of transforming the Mamluk state from a military regime that happened to win a battle into a regional power capable of sustained strategic competition with the Mongols. Baybars is not a scholar or a diplomat. He is a career soldier who rose through the Mamluk system from slave recruit to commanding general, and his approach to ruling is shaped entirely by military logic. He understands that the victory at Jalut bought time, not security. The Mongols are still the dominant power in Persia and Iraq. They still have the capacity to mount another invasion. The only reason they have not done so immediately is internal politics within the Mongol Empire and the vast distances involved. Baybars cannot rely on Mongol inaction. He has to build a defensive system that can deter or defeat a second invasion, and he has to do it quickly. His first priority is intelligence. The Mamluks need to know what the Mongols are doing, where their armies are positioned, when they might be preparing for another westward campaign. Baybars establishes a network of scouts, spies and informants that stretches into Mongol-controlled territory. He cultivates contacts with local populations in Syria and Iraq who can provide warnings of Mongol movements. He sends envoys to potential allies, including the Mongols' enemies within the fractured Mongol Empire itself. The Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate, controlling the steppes north of the Black Sea, is engaged in a bitter rivalry with Hulagu's Ilkhanate over resources and territory. Baybars opens diplomatic channels with the Golden Horde, creating the possibility of coordinated pressure on Hulagu from multiple directions. The second priority is fortifications. Baybars does not assume that the Mamluks can win every open battle against the Mongols. Jalut was fought under favourable conditions with a smaller Mongol force. A full-scale invasion would require a layered defence. Fortified cities that can withstand siege, garrisons that can hold key positions, and the ability to delay and disrupt a Mongol advance long enough for the main Mamluk army to concentrate and respond. He invests heavily in upgrading the fortifications of Syrian cities, particularly those along likely invasion routes. He rebuilds walls, stock supplies, and stations permanent garrisons with clear orders: hold the city, deny the Mongols easy victories, and buy time for reinforcements. The third priority is maintaining the professional army. Baybars understands that the Mamluk military system is the foundation of the state's survival. He continues the recruitment and training programs, purchasing slave soldiers from the Caucasus and Central Asia and cycling them through the barracks in Cairo. He ensures that the army remains concentrated and drilled, not dispersed into garrison duty or private retinues. He personally oversees field exercises, testing unit cohesion and tactical responses. The Mamluk army that defeated Kitbuka was the product of a decade of preparation. Baybars makes certain that this preparation does not lapse, but fortifications and intelligence networks are reactive measures. Baybars also pursues an offensive strategy designed to weaken Mongol control in the borderlands and prevent them from consolidating a forward base for invasion. Between 1260 and 1277, the Mamluks launched repeated raids and campaigns into Mongol-held territory in northern Syria and Anatolia. These are not attempts at conquest. Baybars knows he cannot hold territory deep in Mongol-controlled regions, but attritional operations designed to keep the Mongols off balance, disrupt their logistics, and demonstrate that the Mamluks remain a credible military threat. In 1271, Baybars leads a campaign into Anatolia, striking at fortresses and supply depots that support Mongol control in the region. The Mongols respond with counter-raids, and the frontier becomes a zone of constant low-level warfare. Neither side commits to a decisive engagement on the scale of Jalut, but the cumulative effect is that the Mongols cannot treat Syria as pacified territory. They have to maintain garrisons, defend supply lines, and commit resources to a region that was supposed to be a staging ground for further expansion into Egypt. This attritional strategy is expensive for the Mamluks as well. Maintaining a professional standing army, funding intelligence networks, and launching offensive campaigns requires enormous revenue. Baybars extracts this revenue from Egypt's agricultural base, from trade taxes on goods passing through Syrian ports, and from tribute extracted from weaker neighbours. The Mamluk state under Baybars is not a benevolent administration. It is a war machine that subordinates every other priority to military readiness. The results are undeniable. The Mongols do not invade Egypt. They do not retake Syria. The frontier stabilizes along lines that favour Mamluk control of the Levant, and the Mongol Ilkhanate, preoccupied with internal conflicts and wars with the Golden Horde, does not press the issue. By the time Baybars dies in 1277, the immediate threat of Mongol conquest has receded. The Mamluks have not destroyed the Mongol Empire, but they have established a defensive perimeter that the Mongols cannot break without committing resources that they are unwilling or unable to deploy. This outcome, sustained over decades, is the real victory. Jalut demonstrated that the Mongols could be defeated in open battle. The years after Jalut demonstrated that they could be contained by a military system designed specifically for that purpose. The Mamluks created a strategic stalemate where none had existed before, and they did it through discipline, logistics, and relentless focus on the operational requirements of fighting a steppe cavalry empire. But the broader lesson extends beyond the specifics of the Mamluk-Mongol conflict. What Jalut reveals is a fundamental truth about military power. Dominance is not permanent, and invincibility is not a quality that armies possess inherently. It is a condition that emerges from the interaction between a military system and the environment in which it operates. The Mongols were invincible on the steppe, and in regions where they could maneuver freely, supply their horses through pasture, and exploit the logistical weaknesses of sedentary states. They were not invincible when faced with an opponent who understood their methods, who could match their essential capabilities, and who fought them under conditions that minimized their advantages. The Mamluks did not invent a new form of warfare. They adapted an existing model, steppe cavalry tactics combined with professional training and state logistics, and applied it with discipline and strategic coherence. They did not win because they were inherently superior. They won because they prepared methodically, fought intelligently, and built a system that could sustain itself over time. To understand why this matters beyond the immediate context of 13th century Syria, consider what the Mongol Empire represented to the medieval world. For 40 years, from the rise of Genghis Khan in the early 13th century to the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the Mongols appeared to be an unstoppable force of nature. They conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. They defeated armies that outnumbered them, took cities that had never fallen, and shattered kingdoms that had stood for centuries. To the people living through this period, the Mongols were not just another powerful enemy. They were an apocalyptic threat. a civilization-ending catastrophe that no conventional military force could resist. The psychological impact of this record cannot be overstated. When a Mongol army appeared on the horizon, resistance often collapsed before the fighting even began. Cities surrendered without siege, armies disintegrated at the first contact. Rulers fled or submitted rather than face destruction. This was not cowardice. This was rational calculation based on overwhelming evidence that fighting the Mongols led to annihilation. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 was the culmination of this terror. If the Abbasid Caliphate, the symbolic centre of Sunni Islam, could be erased in a single campaign, then no power in the region had grounds to believe it could survive Mongol attention. The Mamluks in this context were not heroes stepping forward with confidence. They were survivors who had no choice but to fight. Egypt was next on the list. If they did not resist, they would be conquered. If they resisted conventionally, they would be destroyed like every other Islamic power that had tried. Their only option was to build something different, something that could operate within the same strategic framework as the Mongols, while exploiting the specific vulnerabilities that other armies had failed to identify. The key vulnerability was logistical. The Mongol operational model worked brilliantly when the army could remain mobile, when it could draw supplies from conquered territory or from its own herds, and when it could avoid prolonged static engagements. But mobility requires space, and sustained cavalry operations require either pasture or supply lines. In Egypt and Syria, operating far from the Mongol heartland, Kitbuka's force could not draw on unlimited reserves of horses or supplies. His logistics ran through devastated territories that had already been stripped by earlier campaigns. He was operating at the end of a very long supply chain, and the Mamluks, fighting from their own base, were not. This logistical imbalance is what allowed the Mamluks to force a decisive engagement on terms that negated Mongol mobility. At Ain Jalut, the battlefield was not the open steppe. It was a constrained area where the Mongols could not execute their preferred wide envelopments. The Mamluk army, supplied and reinforced from Egypt, could sustain a prolonged fight. The Mongols, without immediate access to remounts or reinforcements, could not. When the battle became attritional, the structural advantage shifted to the side, with the more robust logistical foundation. This is the pattern that repeats throughout military history. Dominant military systems eventually encounter opponents who understand their vulnerabilities, and build counters specifically designed to exploit them. The Roman legions, invincible for centuries, were eventually defeated by opponents who learned to avoid direct confrontation and exploit Roman logistical weaknesses. The Spanish tercios, dominant in European warfare for over a century, were eventually countered by tactics that neutralized their pike and shot formations. The German blitzkrieg, devastatingly effective in the early years of World War II, was eventually contained by opponents who built defensive systems that could absorb the initial shock and counterattack the extended supply lines. The Mongols were no different. Their system was extraordinarily effective, but it was not invincible, and it had inherent limitations that became critical when they fought far from their logistical base against an opponent who understood what they needed to win. The Mamluks identified those needs: mobility, space, time to maneuver, access to pasture and remounts, and systematically denied them. But identifying vulnerabilities is not enough. You also have to have the institutional capacity to build and sustain a counter-system, and this is where most of the Mongols' opponents failed. The Khwarezmian Empire had the resources to field large armies, but it lacked the political cohesion and command structure to coordinate a unified defense. The Caliphate had religious authority and a vast population, but it did not maintain a professional standing army capable of executing complex cavalry maneuvers under pressure. The European kingdoms had fortifications and heavy cavalry, but their feudal levies lacked the discipline and training to fight extended mobile engagements against steppe cavalry. The Mamluks succeeded because they built an institutional structure that could train, supply, and deploy professional cavalry at scale. The slave soldier system, for all its moral horror, created a military caste with no divided loyalties and no alternative paths to status outside the army. The Egyptian agricultural base provided the revenue to sustain the system year after year without requiring the soldiers to support themselves through plunder or feudal land grants. The barracks training produced units that could execute coordinated tactics under combat conditions, and the command structure, centralized under sultans who were themselves products of the military system, ensured that strategic decisions were made by people who understood operational realities. This combination of factors, professional training, reliable logistics, centralized command, and a strategic understanding of enemy vulnerabilities, is what allowed the Mamluks to achieve what no other Islamic power managed in the 13th century. They did not rely on divine intervention or miraculous heroism. They relied on preparation, discipline, and the systematic application of military force designed to neutralize a specific threat. After Ain Jalut, the Mamluk state continued to refine this system. Baybars and his successors maintained the recruitment pipelines, the training programs, and the logistical infrastructure that made the victory possible. They fought numerous campaigns against the Mongols, against Crusader states, against rival Islamic powers, and they won most of them because their military system remained effective over time. The Mamluk Sultanate endured until 1517, when it was finally conquered by the Ottoman Empire, which itself had learned to integrate gunpowder weapons and centralized administration into a military system that could defeat traditional cavalry armies. But the legacy of Ain Jalut is not just about the Mamluks, it is about the nature of military power and the conditions under which dominant systems can be defeated. The Mongols were not invincible because they possessed some inherent superiority. They were dominant because their military system was optimized for a specific style of warfare, and because most of their opponents were not prepared to counter it. When they faced an opponent who had the resources, the institutional capacity, and the strategic understanding to build a counter-system, their dominance ended. This is the lesson that echoes through the centuries. Invincibility is temporary, dominance is contextual, and the most dangerous assumption any military power can make is that past success guarantees future victory. The years following Ain Jalut demonstrate how a single battlefield victory translates into sustained strategic advantage only through relentless follow-through. Baybars does not rest on his laurels. Between 1260 and his death in 1277, he campaigns almost continuously, not because he enjoys war for its own sake, but because he understands that the Mamluk position remains precarious. The Mongol Ilkhanate still exists, Hulagu still commands vast armies. The threat has been checked, not eliminated, and any relaxation of vigilance could allow the Mongols to regroup and strike again. In 1261, the Mongols probe the frontier with a raid into northern Syria. Baybars responds immediately, mobilizing the Mamluk army and marching north to confront them. The Mongols withdraw before a major engagement develops. This becomes the pattern: Mongol raids, Mamluk responses, skirmishes and sieges, but no decisive battles on the scale of Ain Jalut. Both sides are testing each other, measuring capabilities, looking for weaknesses. The Mongols are trying to determine whether Ain Jalut was an anomaly, or whether the Mamluks represent a genuine long-term obstacle. The Mamluks are demonstrating that they can respond quickly to any incursion, and that Syrian territory is no longer open for Mongol exploitation. In 1263, Hulagu himself leads a large force west, apparently intent on avenging Kitbuka's defeat and reasserting Mongol dominance. Baybars mobilizes the full Mamluk army and prepares for a major confrontation. The two forces maneuver through northern Syria and Anatolia, scouting each other, positioning for advantage, but neither side commits to battle. Hulagu's logistics are stretched. His supply lines run through hostile or devastated territory, and the further west he pushes, the more exposed he becomes. Baybars, operating from a secure base in Egypt with supply lines running through controlled territory, can afford to wait. Eventually, Hulagu withdraws. No battle is fought, but the strategic message is clear. The Mongols cannot simply march west and impose their will. The cost of invading Mamluk territory has become prohibitively high. This is the reality of strategic deterrence. Ain Jalut proved that the Mamluks could defeat a Mongol army in open battle. The campaigns of the 1260s and 1270s prove that they can sustain that defensive posture over time, that they can mobilize quickly in response to threats, and that they have the logistical capacity to support prolonged deployments. The Mongols, facing internal conflicts with the Golden Horde and resource constraints in Persia, choose not to commit the overwhelming force that might be necessary to break through the Mamluk defences. The frontier stabilizes not because either side achieves total victory, but because the costs of further aggression outweigh the potential gains. Baybars also moves to eliminate other threats to Mamluk control. The Crusader states, remnants of the European invasions that began in the late 11th century, still hold coastal fortresses and cities in the Levant. These territories are weak, fragmented and incapable of threatening the Mamluks militarily, but they represent potential allies for the Mongols or bases for European intervention. Baybars systematically reduces them. Caesarea falls in 1265, Arsuf in 1265, Safed, a powerful Templar fortress, in 1266, Jaffa in 1268, Antioch, one of the oldest and most significant Crusader cities, falls in 1268 after a siege that ends in the massacre or enslavement of the population. These campaigns are brutal and methodical. Baybars offers terms when it serves his purpose and shows no mercy when it does not. The Crusader states, lacking reinforcements from Europe and unable to coordinate an effective defence, collapse under sustained Mamluk pressure. By the time Baybars dies, the Crusader presence in the Levant has been reduced to a handful of coastal cities, and the eventual expulsion of the Crusaders is only a matter of time. The last Crusader stronghold, Acre, falls to the Mamluks in 1291, ending nearly 2 centuries of European presence in the region. The elimination of the Crusader state serves multiple strategic purposes. It removes potential Mongol allies, consolidates Mamluk control over trade routes and coastal cities, and demonstrates to potential enemies that Mamluk military power is not limited to defensive operations. The Mamluks are capable of offensive campaigns, siege warfare, and sustained territorial conquest. This is not just a reactive power that got lucky once against the Mongols. This is a professional military state that can project force and sustain operations over years and decades. But the foundation of all this success remains the military system itself, the recruitment, training, logistics, and command structure that allow the Mamluks to field effective armies consistently. When Baybars dies in 1277, the state does not collapse. Another Mamluk officer rises to power, the system continues, and the campaigns continue. The Mamluk Sultanate survives political intrigue, internal power struggles, and leadership transitions because the institution is more important than any individual. The army remains loyal to the system that provides their status and livelihood, not to any particular sultan. As long as the barracks remain stocked, the soldiers trained, and the campaigns funded, the state endures. This institutional resilience is rare in medieval polities. Most kingdoms and empires depend on the competence of individual rulers. A weak king or a disputed succession can lead to civil war, fragmentation, or collapse. The Mamluks, by divorcing military power from dynastic legitimacy and embedding it in a professional system, create a state that can survive mediocre leadership and political instability. The Sultan is important, but he is also replaceable. The army is essential, and the army is sustained by the institutional mechanisms that recruit, train, and pay soldiers regardless of who sits on the throne. This is the deeper structural lesson of Jalut and its aftermath. Victory in battle is necessary but not sufficient. To translate a tactical success into lasting strategic advantage, you need institutional systems that can sustain military effectiveness over time. You need logistics that function reliably. You need training programs that produce competent soldiers continuously. You need command structures that survive leadership transitions, and you need a revenue base that can fund all of this without collapsing under the financial strain. The Mamluks built this system, and they built it specifically to counter the Mongol threat. But once built, the system proved adaptable to other challenges. The same professional cavalry that defeated Kit Buka at Ain Jalut also conquered the Crusader fortresses, repelled subsequent Mongol raids, and maintained regional dominance for over 2 centuries. The system was not designed for general-purpose warfare. It was designed to solve a specific problem: how to defeat steppe cavalry empires. But the institutional mechanisms that enabled that solution — professional training, centralized logistics, reliable funding, and operational discipline — proved valuable in a wide range of military contexts. This adaptability is what separates successful military innovations from tactical flukes. A clever battlefield maneuver or a lucky victory can change the outcome of a single engagement. A robust institutional system can change the balance of power for generations. The Mamluks achieved both: a tactical victory at Ain Jalut and an institutional framework that sustained their power long after that battle was forgotten by everyone except historians. But institutional systems, no matter how effective, are not permanent. They succeed under certain conditions and fail when those conditions change. The Mamluk system was optimized for cavalry warfare in an era before gunpowder weapons became dominant. When the Ottomans arrived in the early 16th century with cannons, muskets, and combined arms tactics that integrated firepower with cavalry and infantry, the Mamluk system could not adapt quickly enough. The Ottomans defeated the Mamluks decisively at the Battle of Majd-Dabi in 1516 and conquered Egypt in 1517. The Mamluk Sultanate ended and the region passed into Ottoman control. The lesson here is not that the Mamluks failed, it is that every military system eventually encounters conditions under which it is no longer optimal. The Mongol system dominated for 40 years until it met opponents who understood its vulnerabilities. The Mamluk system dominated for 2.5 centuries until it met opponents with technological and tactical advantages it could not counter. Military power is always contextual, always contingent on the interaction between a system and its environment. Invincibility is an illusion. What exists is competence, preparation, and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. The broader strategic context of the 13th century helps clarify why Jalut mattered beyond the immediate military outcome. By 1260, the Mongol Empire was not a monolithic force, but a fractured confederation of khanates ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan, who were increasingly pursuing independent interests. The Golden Horde controlled the western steppes and Russia. The Chagatai Khanate held Central Asia. The Great Khan ruled from China, and Hulagu's Ilkhanate controlled Persia and claimed authority over the Levant. These khanates competed with each other for resources, territory, and prestige. The unity that had driven the initial conquest was breaking down. This internal fragmentation is part of why Hulagu did not return to Syria with overwhelming force after Jalut. He faced threats from the Golden Horde to his north and political conflicts within the Mongol leadership over succession and territory. The war with Berk Khan of the Golden Horde, which began in the early 1260s, diverted Mongol attention and resources away from the western frontier. Baybars, recognizing this opportunity, cultivated diplomatic ties with Berke, who had converted to Islam and saw Hulagu as a rival and a threat. The Mamluks and the Golden Horde did not fight as formal allies, but their simultaneous pressure on the Ilkhanate created strategic difficulties that Hulagu could not ignore. This is classic balance of power politics. The Mamluks were not strong enough to defeat the entire Mongol Empire, but they were strong enough to hold their ground while the Mongols were distracted by internal conflicts. The combination of Mamluk military capability and Mongol internal division created a strategic equilibrium that neither side could break without prohibitive costs. The frontier stabilized not because the Mamluks became militarily superior to the Mongols in absolute terms, but because the operational and logistical costs of conquering Egypt were higher than the Ilkhanate was willing to pay given its other commitments. This dynamic illustrates an essential strategic principle. You do not need to be stronger than your opponent in every dimension. You need to be strong enough in the right dimensions to make victory costly and uncertain. The Mamluks could not invade Persia and conquer the Ilkhanate, but they could defend Syria and Egypt, respond quickly to Mongol incursions, and make any serious invasion attempt a major logistical and military undertaking with no guarantee of success. That was enough to deter further Mongol aggression. The economic dimension of this conflict is also significant. Egypt under Mamluk control was one of the wealthiest regions in the medieval world. The Nile Delta produced enormous agricultural surpluses, and Cairo was a major hub for trade between the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Spices, textiles, slaves, and luxury goods passed through Egyptian ports, generating customs revenue that funded the Mamluk military machine. The Mamluks controlled this economic engine directly, unlike the decentralized tribal economy of the Mongol steppes, where wealth was distributed among confederated groups and had to be extracted through raids or tribute. This economic foundation allowed the Mamluks to maintain a standing professional army even in peacetime, which was extraordinarily expensive but strategically decisive. Most medieval states could not afford to keep large armies mobilized year-round. They relied on feudal levies or seasonal campaigns that demobilized after harvest. The Mamluks, drawing on Egypt's agricultural and commercial wealth, kept their army in the field or in barracks continuously, ready to deploy within days or weeks of a threat emerging. This rapid response capability was what allowed them to intercept Kitbuka before he could concentrate his forces, and it was what deterred Hulagu from launching a full-scale invasion in the years after Jalut. The technological dimension, meanwhile, remained relatively balanced. Both the Mamluks and the Mongols relied on composite bows, cavalry tactics, and siege engines. Neither side had a decisive technological edge. The difference was not in equipment, but in how that equipment was deployed and sustained. The Mamluks fought from a centralised logistical base with stockpiled supplies and trained reserves. The Mongols operated at the far end of extended supply lines through devastated territory. This logistical asymmetry, more than any technological innovation, determined the outcome of the conflict. But logistics alone does not explain everything. The psychological and cultural dimensions matter as well. The Mamluk soldiers knew that defeat meant not just military loss, but the likely destruction of their entire society. They had seen what the Mongols did to Baghdad. They understood that there was no negotiated peace available, no terms that would allow them to survive as a subordinate power. This was an existential fight, and that knowledge created a level of commitment and cohesion that might not have existed in a less desperate situation. The Mongols, by contrast, were operating in a region that was strategically significant, but not existential. Syria and Egypt were targets of opportunity, territories that would be valuable to control, but were not necessary for the survival of the Ilkhanate. When the costs of conquest became high, and the internal conflicts within the Mongol Empire demanded attention, Hulagu could choose to prioritise other fronts. The Mamluks did not have that option. They had to win, or they would cease to exist. This asymmetry in stakes is another factor that shaped the strategic outcome. The side that cannot afford to lose often fights with greater intensity and resilience than the side that is pursuing an optional objective. The Mongols were accustomed to enemies who collapsed quickly under pressure. When they encountered an enemy who absorbed the pressure and continued fighting, who could not be intimidated into submission and could not be defeated in a single campaign, the calculus changed. The question became whether continued investment in the Syrian front was worth the costs, and the answer, given other priorities and opportunities, was increasingly no. By the 1270s, the frontier between the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ilkhanate had become a stable border, contested but not actively warred over. Raids and skirmishes continued, but no major campaigns were launched. Both sides fortified their positions, maintained armies to deter aggression, and focused on consolidating control over their respective territories. This was not peace in the formal sense. No treaties were signed, no recognition of borders was negotiated, but it was a functional strategic equilibrium that endured for decades. The Mongol threat to the Islamic world did not end with Jalut, but it was contained. The Ilkhanate remained powerful, and its rulers continued to style themselves as conquerors and heirs to Genghis Khan, but they did not expand further west. The Mamluk Sultanate became the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean and the Levant, controlling trade routes and projecting military force across the region. The balance of power that emerged from this conflict shaped the political geography of the Middle East for the next 2 centuries, and at the centre of that balance was the military system the Mamluks had built. Professional, disciplined, logistically supported, and designed specifically to counter the operational methods of steppe cavalry empires. It was not a perfect system. It was brutal, authoritarian, and dependent on the exploitation of slave soldiers who had no choice in their fate. But it was effective, and effectiveness, in the context of existential military conflict, is what matters. The question that historians return to, again and again, is whether Jalut was inevitable or contingent. Could the Mongols have won if circumstances had been slightly different? Could the Mamluks have lost despite their preparation and discipline? The answer is almost certainly yes to both. Battles are decided by narrow margins, and outcomes that appear decisive in retrospect often depend on factors that could easily have tilted the other way. If Hulagu had remained in Syria with his full army instead of withdrawing east, the battle might never have happened, or it might have ended differently. If the terrain at Jalut had been more open, allowing the Mongols greater room to maneuver, their tactical advantages might have prevailed. If Kitbuka had declined battle and withdrawn to consolidate his forces, the strategic dynamic would have shifted. If the Mamluk formations had broken under pressure during the initial engagement, the battle could have turned into the rout that characterized so many Mongol victories. But these contingencies do not diminish the importance of what the Mamluks achieved. They created the conditions under which a Mongol defeat became possible. They built a military system that could exploit Mongol vulnerabilities. They fought the battle under circumstances that minimized Mongol advantages, and they sustained their defensive posture long enough to make a second Mongol invasion strategically unattractive. None of this was guaranteed, But all of it was the result of deliberate preparation and strategic discipline. The contrast with other powers that faced the Mongols is instructive. The Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled much of Central Asia and Persia before the Mongol invasion, had resources comparable to or greater than those of the Mamluks. It fielded large armies, controlled wealthy cities, and had experienced commanders. But it lacked political cohesion. The Shah and his mother feuded over authority. Regional governors pursued independent agendas. The military was a mix of tribal levies, mercenaries, and garrison troops, with no unified command structure or tactical doctrine. When the Mongols invaded in 1219, the Khwarezmian response was fragmented and ineffective. Cities were besieged and taken one by one. Armies were defeated in detail. The Shah fled, and the empire disintegrated within a few years. The Abbasid Caliphate, despite its symbolic authority and the resources of Mesopotamia, also failed to mount a coherent defense. The caliph relied on the prestige of his office and the assumption that the Mongols would negotiate rather than destroy the center of Islamic civilization. When Hulagu arrived with a massive army and siege engines, there was no strategic plan, no coordinated defense, and no fallback position. Baghdad fell, and with it the political structure that had defined Sunni Islam for centuries. The European kingdoms that faced the Mongols in the 1240s fared somewhat better in that they survived, but not because they defeated the Mongols militarily. The Mongol invasion of Poland and Hungary in 1241 shattered every army that opposed it. The Battle of Liegnitz saw a coalition of Polish and German knights destroyed by classic Mongol tactics. The Hungarians suffered multiple defeats, and the Mongol army ranged across the Hungarian plain with minimal resistance. The invasion ended not because the Europeans stopped it, but because the great Khan Ugadai died, and the Mongol commanders withdrew to participate in the succession crisis. Europe was spared by political accident, not military success. The Mamluks, by contrast, achieved what none of these powers managed: a deliberate, sustained, militarily effective defense that defeated Mongol forces in open battle and established a strategic deterrent that lasted for decades. They did not benefit from a timely Mongol withdrawal or political collapse. They had to fight, and they had to win, and they built a system that allowed them to do both. The strategic lesson that emerges from this comparison is that military effectiveness is not just about resources or numbers. It is about organization, discipline, and the capacity to adapt to the specific threat you face. The Khwarezmian Empire had resources but no coherence. The Abbasid Caliphate had legitimacy but no military capability. The European kingdoms had fortifications and heavy cavalry, but no answer to steppe cavalry tactics. The Mamluks had a professional standing army, a unified command structure, a logistical foundation that could sustain prolonged operations, and a tactical doctrine specifically designed to counter Mongol methods. This is not a simple formula. You cannot take these elements and apply them mechanically to any military challenge. The specific circumstances matter. The Mamluks succeeded in part because they were defending territory they controlled, because they fought close to their logistical base, because the Mongols were operating at extended range, and because internal Mongol politics created vulnerabilities that the Mamluks could exploit. Change any of these factors, and the outcome might have been different. But the underlying principle remains valid. To defeat a dominant military system, you need to understand its strengths and weaknesses, build capabilities that neutralize its strengths, exploit its weaknesses, and sustain your efforts long enough to make victory or continued aggression too costly for your opponent to pursue. The Mamluks did all of this with remarkable consistency and discipline. They did not rely on luck or miracles. They relied on preparation, institutional strength, and operational competence. The final years of Baybar's reign, from 1270 to 1277, show this strategic discipline in action. He continues to campaign against Mongol outposts, crusader fortresses, and regional rivals. He negotiates alliances, manages internal political challenges, and maintains the military readiness of the Mamluk army. He does not grow complacent or assume that the threat has passed. He treats security as an ongoing process that requires constant vigilance and effort. When he dies in 1277, possibly from poisoned kumis during a campaign, the transition of power is turbulent but manageable. Another Mamluk officer takes control, the army remains loyal to the system, and the campaigns continue. The state does not collapse. The institutional mechanisms that Baybars reinforced and refined continue to function. This is the mark of a successful military system. It survives the loss of its leaders because it is built on structures and processes, not personalities. The Mamluk Sultanate will face new challenges in the decades and centuries ahead. Mongol pressure will ease as the Ilkhanate becomes more focused on consolidating control in Persia and less interested in Western expansion. The Crusader states will be eliminated entirely by 1291. New threats will emerge, including the rise of the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia, which will eventually conquer the Mamluks in 1517. But for nearly 2.5 centuries, the Mamluk military system that emerged from the crucible of the Mongol Wars will remain the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. And at the centre of that system's origin story is Ain Jalut, the battle where the Mongol advance was stopped, where the illusion of invincibility was shattered, and where a professional military system proved that preparation and discipline could overcome a reputation built on 40 years of conquest. The tactical details of Ain Jalut, when examined closely, reveal how the Mamluks translated their systemic advantages into battlefield outcomes. The engagement was not a chaotic melee where courage and luck determined the winner. It was a controlled, methodical fight where both sides attempted to execute their doctrines, and the Mamluks succeeded in denying the Mongols the conditions they required. From the moment contact was made, the Mamluk commanders focused on maintaining unit cohesion. This sounds simple, but it is extraordinarily difficult under the pressure of combat, especially against an enemy that specializes in creating chaos and exploiting disorganization. The Mongol feigned retreat, which had worked countless times before, depended on enemy units losing formation as they pursued what appeared to be a fleeing enemy. Once the pursuing force was strung out and disorganized, the Mongol wings would close in from the flanks, and the force that had seemed to be retreating would turn and attack. The result was encirclement and destruction. The Mamluks had trained for exactly this scenario. When the Mongol centre began to fall back, the Mamluk vanguard under Baybars pursued, but not recklessly. Units maintained intervals, officers kept control. The pursuit was measured, designed to apply pressure without overextending. When the Mongol wings attempted to envelop, they found not a disordered mob, but formed cavalry units ready to receive them. The Mamluk reserves, positioned deliberately to counter this exact maneuver, moved into blocking positions. This is the essence of tactical discipline, doing what you have trained to do even when every instinct tells you to charge forward or flee. The Mamluk soldiers had drilled these movements repeatedly in training. They knew the sequence. They trusted their commanders. They understood that breaking formation meant death, and holding formation meant survival. This level of discipline is not innate. It is the product of years of professional training in a system that rewards competence and punishes failure. The archery phase of the battle was equally critical. Both sides relied on the composite bow as their primary ranged weapon, and both sides were skilled in its use. The difference was in how the archery was integrated with maneuver. The Mongols typically used archery to harass and weaken enemy formations before closing for melee. The Mamluks, trained in the same methods, matched this capability. They could shoot from horseback, loose arrows rapidly, and maintain accuracy while moving. When the Mongol cavalry tried to use archery to disrupt Mamluk cohesion, the Mamluks returned fire effectively enough to prevent the Mongols from gaining a decisive advantage. This parity in ranged combat meant that the battle could not be decided at distance. It had to be decided in close combat, and close combat favoured the side with greater cohesion and reserves. The Mamluks, fighting on ground they had scouted and with supply lines that allowed them to bring fresh troops and remounts into the engagement, could sustain the melee longer than the Mongols could. The Mongol cavalry, operating without immediate reinforcements and unable to disengage cleanly from the constrained battlefield, began to lose the attritional exchange. The death of Kitbuka, which occurred relatively late in the battle, was not the cause of the Mongol defeat but the confirmation of it. By the time he was killed, the Mongol force was already under severe pressure. The formations were strained, casualties were mounting, and the tactical initiative had shifted to the Mamluks. Kitbuka's death eliminated the command authority that might have organised an effective retreat or a final rally, but the battle was already lost. The Mongol withdrawal that followed was the recognition of a tactical failure, not a collapse caused by panic. This distinction is important because it underscores the structural nature of the Mamluk victory. They did not win because of a lucky blow or a sudden turn of events. They won because they fought the entire engagement according to a plan that exploited Mongol vulnerabilities and because they had the training and discipline to execute that plan under combat conditions. The Mongols fought well, they executed their tactics competently, but they could not overcome the combination of constrained terrain, Mamluk discipline, and the logistical imbalance that allowed the Mamluks to sustain the fight longer. In the broader sweep of military history, Jalut is not unique in demonstrating these principles. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE saw Alexander the Great defeat a larger Persian army by maintaining formation discipline and exploiting gaps in the Persian line. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE saw Hannibal destroy a Roman army through superior tactical coordination and the ability to execute a complex double envelopment. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 saw English longbowmen and dismounted knights defeat a much larger French force by fighting on terrain that negated French cavalry advantages. In each case, the victor succeeded not through brute strength but through tactical discipline, terrain advantage, and the ability to exploit enemy weaknesses. Jalut fits this pattern. The Mamluks did not have more soldiers or better technology. They had better preparation for this specific fight, better cohesion under pressure, and better logistics to sustain the engagement. These advantages, modest individually, combined to produce a decisive outcome. The aftermath of the battle also reveals the strategic discipline that separated the Mamluks from less effective powers. After defeating Kitbukar, the Mamluks did not declare victory and return home. They pursued the retreating Mongol forces, not to annihilate them completely, but to ensure they withdrew from Syrian territory. They secured key cities and fortresses, they established garrisons, they sent patrols to monitor Mongol movements. This was consolidation, the unglamorous but essential work of translating a battlefield victory into territorial control. Many armies in history have won battles and then squandered the advantage through poor follow-up. The Mamluks did not make this mistake. They understood that Jalut was the beginning of a strategic campaign, not the end. They had proven they could defeat the Mongols in battle. Now they had to prove they could hold territory against Mongol counterattacks. At the same time, Jalut also marked a turning point for the Mongol Empire itself. The failure to conquer Egypt and the Levant represented the first clear and permanent limit to Mongol expansion in the West. The Mongols had been stopped before, temporarily by terrain or logistics or seasonal constraints, but they had always returned to complete the conquest. After Jalut, they did not return. The frontier stabilized, and the Mongol Empire, which had grown through continuous expansion for 4 decades, began to consolidate rather than expand. This consolidation was not just a result of the Mamluk resistance, it was also driven by internal dynamics within the Mongol Empire. The death of Mongke Khan in 1259 had triggered a succession crisis that fractured the empire into competing khanates. The unity of purpose that had driven the initial conquests under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors was breaking down. The khanates pursued regional interests, fought each other for resources and territory, and became less focused on unlimited expansion and more focused on governing the territories they already controlled. But the Mamluk resistance accelerated this process. Hulagu and his successors could not ignore the fact that further westward expansion was no longer a straightforward military operation. It would require a sustained, costly campaign against an opponent that had proven its ability to resist. Given the other challenges the Ilkhanate faced, including wars with the Golden Horde and the need to consolidate control over Persia and Iraq, the decision to accept the frontier with the Mamluks was rational. The cost-benefit calculus no longer favoured continued aggression. This is how strategic deterrence works. The Mamluks did not need to defeat the entire Mongol Empire. They needed to make the cost of invading their territory high enough that the Mongols chose to pursue other priorities. By demonstrating military competence at Ain Jalut and sustaining their defensive posture in the years that followed, they achieved exactly that. The Mongols remained a threat, but they were a manageable threat, one that could be deterred through readiness and credible capability. The long-term legacy of the Mamluk military system is complex. On one hand, it was extraordinarily effective for its time and context. It defeated the Mongols, eliminated the Crusader states, and maintained regional dominance for over 2 centuries. On the other hand, it was also rigid and resistant to change. The Mamluk system was built around heavy cavalry and traditional siege warfare. When gunpowder weapons became widespread in the 15th and 16th centuries, the Mamluks were slow to adapt. They continued to prioritize cavalry training and traditional tactics, even as their opponents integrated cannons, arquebuses, and combined arms formations that rendered traditional cavalry charges less effective. This rigidity proved fatal when the Ottoman Empire expanded south in the early 16th century. The Ottomans had embraced gunpowder technology, developing effective artillery and infantry equipped with firearms. At the Battle of Majd-Dabik in 1516, the Mamluk cavalry charged Ottoman positions and were shattered by concentrated cannon and musket fire. The Mamluks fought bravely and maintained their traditional tactics, but bravery and tradition were not enough against an opponent with superior technology and tactics designed to counter cavalry. The Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517 ended the Mamluk Sultanate as an independent power. This outcome reinforces a consistent theme. Military systems that succeed in one era can become liabilities in the next if they fail to adapt to changing conditions. The Mamluks built a system optimized for defeating steppe cavalry empires in the 13th century. That system worked brilliantly for its intended purpose, but when the nature of a warfare changed with the introduction of gunpowder weapons, the Mamluk system could not adapt quickly enough. The institutional mechanisms that had been so effective at producing professional cavalry proved much less effective at integrating new technologies and new tactical doctrines. This is not a failure unique to the Mamluks. Every dominant military system in history eventually encounters conditions under which it is no longer optimal. The Roman legions dominated for centuries, and then were gradually defeated by opponents who learned to exploit their weaknesses. The European knights who ruled medieval battlefields were rendered obsolete by longbows, pikes, and eventually gunpowder. The battleships that defined naval power in the early 20th century were made vulnerable by aircraft carriers and submarines. Military dominance is always temporary because warfare is always evolving. The strategic lesson is not that adaptation is easy, or that failure to adapt represents incompetence. The lesson is that success in one context does not guarantee success in another, and that institutions built to solve specific problems often struggle to recognize and respond to new problems that require fundamentally different solutions. The Mamluks succeeded brilliantly at defeating the Mongols because they built a system specifically for that purpose. They failed against the Ottomans because the system they had built was not suited to the new challenges of gunpowder warfare. But this eventual failure does not diminish what the Mamluks achieved in the 13th century. They faced an existential threat, built a military system capable of countering it, defeated the most successful military power of their era, and sustained their defense for decades. They turned what appeared to be inevitable conquest into a stable frontier. They transformed a regional disaster into a foundation for long-term security. And they did all of this through discipline, preparation, and strategic focus rather than through luck or miracles. The story of Jalut is ultimately a story about the nature of power and the conditions under which dominant systems can be challenged. The Mongols were not defeated because they became weak or incompetent. They were defeated because they encountered an opponent who understood their methods, built capabilities to counter them, and fought under conditions that minimized Mongol advantages. This is the only reliable way to challenge a dominant power, not through wishful thinking or desperate heroism, but through systematic preparation and strategic discipline. The strategic architecture that allowed the Mamluks to succeed where others failed rested on three interlocking foundations: professional military training that produced soldiers capable of executing complex maneuvers under pressure, a logistical system that could sustain operations without depending on plunder or seasonal dispersal, and a command structure that maintained unity of purpose across campaigns and leadership transitions. Remove any one of these elements, and the system collapses. The Khwarezmians had resources but lacked unified command. The Europeans had fortifications but lacked professional cavalry that could fight mobile campaigns. The Abbasids had legitimacy but lacked both the military capability and the institutional mechanisms to coordinate a defense. The Mamluks integrated all three elements into a coherent whole, and they did so deliberately, with clear awareness of what they needed to survive. This was not accidental. The slave soldier system, for all its moral darkness, was a calculated solution to a strategic problem: how to create a military force with no divided loyalties, no tribal affiliations that might fragment under pressure, and no alternative path to status except through military service to the state. The Egyptian agricultural base was exploited systematically to generate the revenue necessary to maintain this force year after year. The training regimen was brutal and comprehensive because anything less would produce soldiers who could not stand against the Mongols. This level of strategic clarity is rare. Most states stumble into military systems through historical accident, cultural tradition, or piecemeal adaptation to immediate threats. The Mamluks built their system with a specific enemy in mind and a clear understanding of what defeating that enemy would require. They were not trying to create a general-purpose military force. They were trying to create a force that could counter Mongol operational methods, and they succeeded because they focused relentlessly on that objective. The implications for understanding military power are significant. Invincibility is not a permanent condition. It is the result of a military system operating in an environment where its strengths are maximized and its weaknesses are not exploited. Change the environment, and the system that appeared invincible becomes vulnerable. The Mongols dominated the open steppe and the initial phases of invasion into sedentary territories because their operational model was optimized for those conditions. When they faced an opponent who could fight on similar terms, who understood their tactics, and who operated from a logistical foundation that did not require constant mobility, their advantages diminished. This is why studying Jalut matters beyond the specifics of 13th century warfare. The principles that determine the outcome are not unique to cavalry warfare or pre-gunpowder conflicts. They apply whenever a dominant military system encounters an opponent who has analysed its methods, identified its vulnerabilities, and built capabilities specifically designed to exploit those vulnerabilities. The tactics change with technology and geography. The underlying strategic logic remains constant. Preparation matters more than improvisation. Discipline matters more than courage. Logistics matter more than tactics. Institutional stability matters more than individual brilliance. These are not exciting truths. They do not make for dramatic narratives where heroes turn the tide through personal valor. But they are the truths that determine outcomes when professional military systems collide. The Mamluks at Jalut were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were professional soldiers executing a mission they had trained for, supported by a logistical system that allowed them to sustain operations, commanded by officers who understood both their own capabilities and enemy weaknesses. They fought well, but they won because the system they operated within was designed to produce exactly this kind of competent, disciplined performance under the specific conditions they faced. Kitbuka and his Mongol soldiers were equally professional, equally disciplined, equally committed. They lost not because they fought poorly, but because they were operating at a structural disadvantage, extended supply lines, constrained terrain, outnumbered or at parity rather than enjoying the numerical superiority they often achieved through strategic concentration, and facing an enemy that would not break under the tactics that had shattered so many other armies. The Mongol system was still effective. It simply was not effective enough under these specific conditions to overcome an opponent who had prepared methodically for exactly this fight. This is what makes Jalut strategically significant. It was not an upset or a fluke. It was the result of strategic preparation meeting operational execution. The Mamluks created the conditions for their victory through years of institutional development before the battle and through tactical discipline during it. They did not get lucky. They got prepared. And the lesson that echoes across the centuries is this: no military system, no matter how successful, is invincible against an opponent who understands how it works and builds the capabilities to counter it. Dominance is contextual, power is contingent, and the most dangerous assumption any military force can make is that past success guarantees future victory. The Mongols learned this at Jalut. They remained a formidable power for generations, but they never again appeared unstoppable. The Mamluks proved that they could be beaten, and that proof changed the strategic calculus across the region. The frontier stabilized, the Islamic world survived, and the military system that achieved this, built on the ruthless logic of professional training, logistical sustainability, and operational discipline, endured for 2.5 centuries until it met a new set of challenges it could not overcome. If you found this exploration of medieval warfare and strategic competition compelling, consider subscribing for more long-form historical analysis. Leave a comment with the battles or campaigns you'd like to see examined next. Military history is not just about what happened. It is about why it happened, what structures and decisions created the conditions for success or failure, and what lessons carry forward to shape how we understand power and conflict today. The Mongols were not invincible. No army ever is. What matters is whether you understand the conditions under which dominance can be challenged and whether you have the discipline and institutional capacity to build a system that can do the challenging. The Mamluks had both. That is why they succeeded where so many others failed, and that is why Ain Jalut remains a defining moment in military history, the day the unstoppable army was stopped. The decade following Ain Jalut, from 1260 to 1270, reveals how battlefield success translates into regional dominance through sustained operational pressure. Baybars does not treat the victory as the end of a campaign, but as the opening of a strategic opportunity. The Mongols have been forced out of Syria, but they remain powerful in Persia and Iraq. The Crusader states still hold fortified positions along the coast. Regional powers watch to see whether the Mamluks can consolidate their gains, or whether the victory at Ain Jalut will prove temporary. Baybars' first objective is to eliminate any possibility of a Mongol-Crusader alliance. The Crusader states, weak and fragmented, cannot threaten the Mamluks directly, but they could provide bases and logistical support for a Mongol invasion. Frankish ports could land reinforcements from Europe. Crusader fortresses could anchor a Mongol advance into the Levant. The strategic geography of the region means that as long as the Crusaders control coastal cities, the Mamluks face the possibility of a two-front war. In 1263, Baybars begins systematic operations against Crusader positions. He does not attempt to conquer everything at once. He targets specific fortresses that threaten Mamluk supply lines or that could serve as Mongol bases. Caesarea falls in 1265 after a brief siege. The city's walls are breached by siege engines and the garrison surrenders. Baybars offers terms to those who submit and shows no mercy to those who resist. This combination of calculated brutality and pragmatic negotiation becomes his signature approach. The siege of Arsuf in 1265 follows the same pattern. The fortress, held by the Hospitallers, is isolated and cut off from reinforcement. Baybars brings siege engines, including mangonels and trebuchets, operated by engineers who understand the mathematics of trajectory and impact. The Mamluks do not simply surround the fortress and wait for starvation. They actively assault the walls, undermining foundations, battering gates, and maintaining constant pressure until the defenders recognize that relief is not coming and continued resistance means death. The fortress falls, and the Hospitallers who survive are either ransomed or enslaved. The capture of Safed in 1266 is more significant. This is one of the largest Templar fortresses in the Levant, positioned on a height that dominates the surrounding region. The fortress has never fallen to direct assault. Its walls are thick, its garrison is experienced, and its supply of water and food can sustain a prolonged siege. Baybars invests the fortress with a large force and settles in for a campaign of attrition. He cuts supply lines, patrols the surrounding territory to prevent relief, and deploys siege engines to hammer the walls continuously. The siege lasts weeks. The defenders hold, expecting that reinforcements will arrive or that Baybars will be forced to withdraw due to other commitments. But Baybars does not withdraw. He maintains the siege through the summer heat, rotating his troops to keep them fresh, bringing supplies from Egypt to sustain his army, and demonstrating that the Mamluks can maintain prolonged operations far from their base. This logistical capability, often overlooked in dramatic accounts of sieges, is what makes the victory possible. The Templars inside Safed are isolated, running low on supplies, and watching their walls crumble under sustained bombardment. When Baybars offers terms, the garrison negotiates a surrender. They are promised safe passage. Baybars then executes them anyway, sending a message that further resistance is futile and that Mamluk power is absolute. This act of treachery, shocking even by the brutal standards of medieval warfare, serves a strategic purpose. It breaks the morale of other Crusader garrisons. When the Mamluks appear outside the next fortress, the defenders know that surrender may not save them and that their only real choice is to flee or fight to the death. This creates panic and accelerates the collapse of Crusader defences. Fortresses that might have held for months surrender within weeks. Cities that might have negotiated favourable terms accept whatever Baybars offers. Jaffa falls in 1268. The city's defences are adequate, but the garrison is small and the population knows what happened at Safed. When Mamluk forces arrive, the city opens its gates rather than face a siege. Baybars takes control, expels the Frankish population, and incorporates the city into the Mamluk administrative system. Antioch, one of the great Crusader cities, falls the same year after a siege that ends in one of the most brutal sacks of the era. Thousands are killed or enslaved, and the city, once a thriving centre of Crusader power, is reduced to a shadow of its former importance. These campaigns serve multiple strategic purposes. They eliminate potential bases for Mongol operations. They generate plunder and captives that enrich the Mamluk state and reward the soldiers. They demonstrate to regional powers that Mamluk military dominance is not limited to defensive operations against the Mongols, and they consolidate Baybar's personal authority within the Mamluk hierarchy. He is not just the Sultan who defeated the Mongols, he is the conqueror who is systematically eliminating every threat to Mamluk power in the region. But these offensive campaigns do not distract Baybars from the primary threat. Throughout this period, he maintains constant vigilance against the possibility of a renewed Mongol invasion. Intelligence networks monitor Mongol movements in Iraq and Persia. Scouts patrol the frontier. Garrisons are maintained in Syrian cities along likely invasion routes. The Mamluk army conducts regular drills and field exercises to ensure that units remain ready for rapid deployment. Baybars understands that the Mongols have not accepted permanent defeat, and that any sign of Mamluk weakness could trigger another invasion. In 1271, the Mongols test the frontier with a significant raid into northern Syria. The force is not large enough for a full invasion, but it is substantial enough to threaten Mamluk positions and gauge the response. Baybars mobilizes immediately, marching north with the main Mamluk army and positioning his forces to intercept the Mongol raiders. The Mongols, seeing a coordinated and rapid Mamluk response, withdraw before a major engagement develops. This is not a battle, but it is a strategic success. The Mamluks have demonstrated that they can detect and respond to Mongol movements quickly, that their intelligence network functions effectively, and that their army remains capable of rapid mobilization and deployment. This pattern of raid and response continues through the early 1270s. The Mongols probe, the Mamluks respond, and neither side commits to a decisive engagement. Both recognize that a major battle would be costly, and that the strategic stakes do not justify the risk. The frontier stabilizes not through formal treaty, but through mutual recognition that further escalation is not worth the cost. The Mamluks have proven they can defend their territory. The Mongols have concluded that conquering that territory would require a commitment of resources they are unwilling to make. By 1275, the Mamluk position in Syria and the Levant is secure. The Crusader presence has been reduced to a handful of coastal fortresses that pose no strategic threat. The Mongol frontier is stable and defended by a network of fortifications and garrisons. The Mamluk army remains the most effective military force in the region, capable of rapid deployment and sustained operations. Baybars has transformed a battlefield victory into regional hegemony through relentless operational pressure, strategic discipline, and the systematic elimination of every potential threat. This transformation did not happen through inspiration or heroic leadership alone. It happened because the institutional systems that produced the victory at Jalut continued to function effectively year after year. The recruitment of slave soldiers continued, maintaining the pipeline of trained cavalry. The Egyptian agricultural economy continued to generate revenue, funding military operations and logistical support. The command structure remained unified and disciplined, executing Baybars' strategic vision without fragmentation or internal conflict. The system worked because it was designed to work, and because every element of that system was maintained and reinforced through constant attention and investment. The diplomatic dimension of Mamluk strategy during this period is as sophisticated as the military dimension, and it reveals a level of strategic thinking that goes beyond battlefield tactics. Baybars understands that the Mamluk Sultanate, for all its military effectiveness, cannot fight the entire world simultaneously. The Mongol Ilkhanate remains powerful. The remnants of the Crusader states, though weakened, maintain connections to Europe. Regional powers in Anatolia, Armenia, and the Arabian Peninsula pursue their own interests, and could potentially align with Mamluk enemies. To secure Egypt and Syria, Baybars needs not just military strength but a diplomatic network that isolates his enemies and prevents hostile coalitions from forming. His most audacious diplomatic move is the opening of relations with the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that controls the steppes north of the Black Sea and the Caucasus. The Golden Horde, under Berke Khan, is locked in a bitter conflict with Hulagu's Ilkhanate over control of the Caucasus and Azerbaijan. This conflict is not merely territorial, it has religious and political dimensions. Berke has converted to Islam, while Hulagu and his successors maintain traditional Mongol religious practices and tolerance. The two Khanates compete for resources, prestige, and influence within the broader Mongol world. Baybars recognises this rift as an opportunity. If the Mamluks and the Golden Horde coordinate their pressure on the Ilkhanate, Hulagu and his successors will face a two-front strategic dilemma. Any resources committed to a Western campaign against the Mamluks will weaken the Ilkhanate's position against the Golden Horde, and vice versa. This does not require a formal military alliance. It simply requires communication, coordination of timing, and mutual recognition that both powers benefit from keeping the Ilkhanate off balance. Establishing contact with the Golden Horde is not simple. The route from Cairo to the Golden Horde's territories runs through hostile or unstable regions. Envoys must travel through Anatolia, across the Black Sea, or through the Caucasus, all of which are contested or dangerous. Baybars sends multiple diplomatic missions, some of which are captured or killed by Ilkhanate forces, but enough get through to establish communication. By the mid-1260s, diplomatic exchanges are regular enough that the Mamluks and the Golden Horde can coordinate their actions, at least loosely. This coordination is never perfect or formalized. The Golden Horde and the Mamluks do not fight as allies in the conventional sense. They do not conduct joint military operations or share resources, but they time their campaigns to create maximum pressure on the Ilkhanate. When Baybars launches raids into northern Syria, the Golden Horde often increases pressure on the Ilkhanate's northern frontier. When the Ilkhanate masses forces to respond to one threat, the other becomes more aggressive. This strategic coordination forces the Ilkhanate to disperse its forces and prevents it from concentrating overwhelming strength against either opponent. Baybars also cultivates relations with the Byzantine Empire, or what remains of it. The Byzantine state, once the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean, has been shattered by the Fourth Crusade and the Latin occupation of Constantinople. By the 1260s, the Byzantine Empire has been partially restored under the Palaiologos dynasty, but it is weak, surrounded by threats, and struggling to survive. The Byzantines have no love for the Mamluks, but they have even less love for the Latin Crusader states, and are wary of Mongol expansion into Anatolia. Baybars proposes pragmatic arrangements, trade access, intelligence sharing, mutual recognition of borders. The Byzantines are cautious but willing to engage. They need any allies they can find, and the Mamluks, whatever their other qualities, are a stabilizing force in a region that has been consumed by warfare for decades. The relationship never becomes warm, but it serves the interests of both powers by reducing the number of enemies each faces. Relations with the Crusader states are more complex. Baybars is systematically dismantling their military position, but he is also willing to negotiate when it serves his purposes. Some Crusader cities pay tribute in exchange for temporary peace. Some fortresses surrender in exchange for safe passage for their garrisons. Baybars uses these negotiations to extract intelligence about Crusader defences, internal politics, and connections to Europe. He offers terms when he believes that doing so will accelerate the collapse of Crusader power, and he shows no mercy when he believes that brutality will be more effective. The key to this diplomatic strategy is flexibility. Baybars does not commit to rigid alliances or ideological positions. He evaluates each relationship based on whether it serves Mamluk strategic interests. He negotiates with Christian powers when useful, maintains relations with the Islamic Golden Horde despite their Mongol identity, and eliminates Crusader states that pose threats while temporarily accommodating those that do not. This pragmatic approach, unencumbered by religious or cultural rigidity, allows the Mamluks to isolate their primary enemies and avoid fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The domestic dimension of Mamluk power during this period also requires constant attention. The Mamluk state is not a traditional hereditary monarchy. Power is held by military officers who rose through the slave soldier system, and succession is determined by internal politics and military strength rather than bloodline. This creates a system that rewards competence, but also generates constant factional competition. Baybars, who himself took power through the assassination of Qutuz, understands that he must maintain the loyalty of the Mamluk military elite or face the same fate. He does this through a combination of military success, distribution of wealth, and careful management of factional rivalries. The campaigns against the Crusaders generate enormous plunder: gold, silver, trade goods, captives who can be sold or ransomed. Baybars distributes this wealth generously to his officers and soldiers, ensuring that military service remains profitable and that the army has a vested interest in continued success. He rotates commands to prevent any single officer from building an independent power base. He promotes capable subordinates but removes or eliminates those who show signs of disloyalty or excessive ambition. This internal management is exhausting and requires constant vigilance, but it is essential to maintaining the stability of the Mamluk state. A sultan who loses control of the military elite does not remain sultan for long. Baybars' success in maintaining power for 17 years, an unusually long reign by Mamluk standards, is testament to his skill in managing both external enemies and internal rivals. The economic management of the Mamluk state is equally critical. Maintaining a professional standing army, conducting annual campaigns, building fortifications and funding intelligence networks requires enormous resources. Egypt's agricultural base provides the foundation, but that revenue must be extracted, administered, and distributed efficiently. Baybars maintains the existing tax apparatus, extracts tribute from subordinate territories, and controls trade routes that pass through Syrian ports. The revenue flows into the state treasury, and from there it funds the military machine that maintains Mamluk power. This economic system is exploitative and extractive. The Egyptian peasantry bears the burden of taxation that funds wars they have no stake in. Conquered territories are taxed heavily to support Mamluk garrisons and campaigns, but the system functions and it generates the resources necessary to sustain a professional military establishment that can compete with the largest powers in the region. The Mamluks do not achieve their dominance through economic innovation or prosperity. They achieve it through the systematic extraction and concentration of resources in service of military power. By the mid-1270s, the Mamluk Sultanate has become the dominant regional power through a combination of military effectiveness, diplomatic maneuvering, and internal stability. The victory at Ain Jalut opened the door, but it was the decade of relentless consolidation that followed which transformed a battlefield success into lasting strategic advantage. The Mongol threat has been contained. The Crusader states have been reduced to insignificance. Regional rivals have been neutralized or subordinated, and the Mamluk military system continues to function at a high level of effectiveness, ready to respond to any threat that emerges. This is not a story of sudden transformation or miraculous salvation. It is a story of systematic effort sustained over years, of strategic discipline maintained through constant pressure, and of institutional systems that function effectively because they are designed and managed with clear objectives. The Mamluks built a regional empire not through inspiration but through preparation, not through heroism but through competence, and not through luck but through relentless operational and diplomatic effort. The military infrastructure that sustained Mamluk power deserves closer examination because it reveals how battlefield effectiveness depends on systems that extend far beyond the moment of combat. The Mamluk army that fought at Ain Jalut and in the campaigns that followed was not simply a collection of skilled warriors. It was the visible edge of an institutional apparatus that included recruitment networks, training facilities, supply depots, weapons production, veterinary services for horses, intelligence gathering, and administrative bureaucracies that coordinated all of these functions. The recruitment system operated continuously. Mamluk agents travelled to slave markets in the Black Sea region, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, purchasing boys who met specific criteria: physical fitness, appropriate age for training, and ethnic backgrounds that indicated they came from cultures with cavalry traditions. Kipchak Turks from the steppes north of the Black Sea were particularly valued because they came from pastoral societies, where riding and archery were fundamental skills learned in childhood. Circassians from the Caucasus, Mongols captured in border raids, and various Turkic peoples all entered the system. These boys, purchased as commodities, were transported to Cairo and housed in the citadel barracks. The training program they entered was comprehensive and brutal. Physical conditioning came first, riding for hours each day, building the leg strength and balance necessary to control a horse without reins, developing the core stability to shoot accurately from a moving mount. Archery training was relentless. The composite bow requires enormous strength to draw fully, and accuracy at range requires thousands of hours of practice. The recruits shot at targets from horseback, from standing positions, from various ranges and angles until the motions became automatic. Close combat training with sabres and lances followed. The Mamluks fought primarily as cavalry, but they also needed to be capable in dismounted combat for siege warfare and urban fighting. Wrestling and hand-to-hand combat were part of the regimen. So was formation drill, learning to maintain position in a cavalry charge, to execute coordinated turns and withdrawals, to respond to officer commands in the chaos of battle. The training was designed to produce soldiers who could function effectively as part of a unit, not just as individual warriors. Religious instruction was integrated into military training. The recruits were converted to Islam if they were not already Muslim, taught basic religious practices, and given enough literacy to read the Quran and follow written orders. This religious dimension served multiple purposes. It provided cultural cohesion, reinforced loyalty to the Islamic state they served, and created a shared identity that transcended their diverse ethnic origins. A Kipchak and a Circassian might have no common language or culture when they arrived, but after years in the barracks they shared Islam, military training, and the identity of Mamluk soldier. The training period lasted years, typically between 5 and 10 depending on the recruit's starting skill level and the needs of the army. Upon completion, the soldiers were formally manumitted, freed from slavery, and enrolled in active military units. This manumission was not just a legal formality. It marked their transition from property to professional soldiers with status, pay, and prospects for advancement. A successful Mamluk could rise to command positions, accumulate wealth through military service, and potentially even become sultan. The system offered no alternative paths to status, but the path it did offer was real and achievable through competence and loyalty. The logistics of maintaining this force was staggering. Horses were the foundation of Mamluk military power, and horses require vast amounts of fodder. A cavalry horse consumes roughly 20 to 30 pounds of hay or grain per day, more during active campaigning. The Mamluk army maintained thousands of horses, which meant procuring, storing, and transporting enormous quantities of feed. Egypt's agricultural system produced grain surpluses that could be diverted to military use. But even so, the logistics of feeding the cavalry were a constant challenge. Weapons production was centralized in state workshops. The composite bow, the primary Mamluk weapon, was a sophisticated piece of technology that required skilled craftsmen to construct. Layers of wood, horn, and sinew had to be laminated together with animal glue, shaped precisely, and allowed to cure for months or even years to achieve optimal performance. Each bow was effectively custom-made, and the workshops in Cairo produced them in sufficient quantities to equip the entire army. Arrows, sabres, lances, armour and horse equipment were all manufactured in state facilities and distributed through the military supply system. Medical services, though primitive by modern standards, were organised and available. Campaign armies included physicians who could treat wounds, set broken bones, and manage diseases. Veterinary services were even more critical because disabled horses threatened operational mobility. Veterinarians travelled with the army, treating injuries and illnesses in the cavalry mounts. The Mamluks understood that maintaining horse health was as important as maintaining soldier health, and they allocated resources accordingly. The intelligence network that supported Mamluk operations extended across the region. Scouts and spies operated in Mongol-controlled territories, Crusader cities, and neighbouring states. Merchants, travellers, and informants provided information on troop movements, political developments, and potential threats. This intelligence was collected, analysed, and reported to the Sultan and military commanders, allowing the Mamluks to respond to threats before they fully developed. The victory at Jalut was possible in part because Mamluk intelligence identified the size and position of Kitbuka's force, allowing Qutuz to engage under favourable conditions. The administrative bureaucracy that coordinated all of these functions was staffed by civilian officials, many of whom were Coptic Christians or other non-Muslims with administrative expertise. These officials managed tax collection, supply procurement, record keeping, and the countless other tasks necessary to keep the military machine functioning. The Mamluk military elite focused on warfare and politics. The civilian bureaucracy handled the logistics and administration that made military operations possible. This division of labour was efficient but also created tensions. The Mamluk soldiers, who held political power, often had contempt for the civilian administrators, who lacked military credentials. The civilian officials, meanwhile, resented their subordinate status, despite their essential contributions to state functioning. These tensions occasionally erupted into conflicts, purges, or administrative disruptions, but the system generally held together because both groups recognized their mutual dependence. The financial apparatus that funded all of this was based on systematic taxation of Egypt's agricultural economy. Land taxes, poll taxes on non-Muslims, customs duties on trade, and tribute from subordinate territories generated the revenue that paid soldiers, purchased supplies, and maintained infrastructure. The tax burden was heavy, and it fell disproportionately on the peasantry and urban populations who had no voice in how the revenue was spent. But the system extracted sufficient resources to sustain a professional military establishment that could compete with the largest empires of the era. This infrastructure, invisible in most accounts of medieval warfare, was what made Mamluk military success possible. Battlefield tactics mattered, command decisions mattered, soldier skill and courage mattered. But all of these factors depended on an institutional foundation that recruited soldiers, trained them for years, equipped them with sophisticated weapons, fed their horses, gathered intelligence, and coordinated operations across hundreds of miles. Without this foundation, the Mamluks would have been just another regional power with brave soldiers and competent commanders. With it, they became a military state capable of defeating the Mongols and dominating the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The contrast with the Mongol system highlights why the Mamluks succeeded where others failed. The Mongols drew military strength from a social structure where every male was a potential warrior from childhood, where horses were abundant through pastoral herding, and where the entire society was organized for war and migration. This gave them enormous advantages in speed, mobility, and operational reach. But it also meant they depended on pasture for their horses, plunder for much of their supplies, and continuous expansion to maintain internal cohesion. The Mamluks built a different kind of system, one that traded some mobility for logistical sustainability and some operational reach for concentrated striking power. They could not range across continents the way Mongol armies did, but they could maintain a professional force in one region indefinitely, could sustain prolonged campaigns without dispersing to find pasture, and could rebuild losses through systematic recruitment and training, rather than depending on tribal population growth. When these two systems collided at Ain Jalut, the Mongols' traditional advantages were partially neutralized by constrained terrain and extended supply lines, while the Mamluks' advantages in logistical support and concentrated force were maximized. The social structure of the Mamluk state, built on the systematic enslavement and military training of foreign boys, raises questions about the relationship between military effectiveness and moral legitimacy. The system was designed to produce soldiers with no competing loyalties, no family ties that might compromise their commitment, and no alternative paths to status or wealth. This made the Mamluks extraordinarily effective as a military force. It also made the system dependent on a continuous supply of enslaved children, torn from their families and cultures, subjected to brutal training, and given no choice in their fate. The moral horror of this system is undeniable from a modern perspective. These were children, typically between 8 and 14 years old, purchased in slave markets and transported hundreds of miles to serve a state they had no connection to. Many died during the journey, others died during training. Those who survived were transformed into instruments of military power, their identities erased and replaced with a new identity as Mamluk soldiers. They were given status and opportunity within the system, but only by accepting that they had no existence outside it. Yet this same system produced the military force that stopped the Mongol advance, that preserved the Islamic world from the catastrophic destruction that had already consumed Persia and Mesopotamia, and that maintained regional stability for over 2 centuries. The Mamluks were not defending an abstract ideal of freedom or justice. They were defending their own power and the structure that gave them status. But in doing so, they also prevented the Mongol conquest of Egypt and the Levant, which would have resulted in mass death, urban destruction, and the collapse of the economic and cultural systems that sustained millions of people. This tension between moral horror and historical effectiveness is not unique to the Mamluks. Many military systems throughout history have been built on exploitation, coercion, or violence against vulnerable populations. The Roman legions conquered and enslaved entire peoples. The Spanish conquistadors built their empire on the systematic exploitation and destruction of indigenous populations. Modern military conscription, practiced by most nations during the 20th century, compelled millions of men to serve in wars they did not choose and often did not support. The question is not whether military systems are morally pure, they rarely are, but whether the outcomes they produce are preferable to the alternatives. In the case of the Mamluks, the alternative to their military success was Mongol conquest, which the historical record suggests would have been catastrophic. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 killed tens of thousands and destroyed centuries of accumulated knowledge and culture. The Mongol campaigns in Persia depopulated entire regions. If the Mongols had conquered Egypt with similar methods, the human cost would have been enormous. The Mamluk system, for all its brutality toward the children it enslaved and trained, preserved a society that sustained millions and maintained one of the great centers of Islamic civilization. This does not excuse or justify the system. It simply acknowledges the historical reality that military effectiveness and moral legitimacy are not always aligned, and that the preservation of societies often depends on institutions that would be considered abhorrent by other standards. The Mamluks were not heroes. They were professional soldiers operating within a system designed to maximize military power. That system succeeded in its immediate objectives, even as it inflicted terrible costs on those who were ground through its mechanisms. The long-term consequences of the Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut extend far beyond the immediate military and political outcomes. The stabilization of the frontier between the Mamluk Sultanate and the Mongol Ilkhanate created a geographic division that shaped the development of the Islamic world for centuries. Egypt and the Levant remained under Mamluk control, preserving continuity with earlier Islamic traditions and institutions. Persia and Iraq came under Mongol rule, which over time integrated elements of Islamic culture and administration, but maintained distinct political structures and cultural influences from Central Asia. This division created different trajectories of development. The Mamluk territories maintained traditional Islamic scholarship, legal systems, and cultural practices with relatively little disruption. Cairo became one of the great centers of Islamic learning, attracting scholars from across the Muslim world. The Mamluk sultans patronized religious institutions, built mosques and madrasas, and positioned themselves as protectors of Sunni orthodoxy. This was partly genuine religious commitment and partly political calculation, a way to legitimize a military regime that lacked traditional dynastic credentials. The Mongol territories underwent more dramatic transformation. The Ilkhanate, initially hostile to Islam and supportive of other religions, including Christianity and Buddhism, gradually converted. By the early 14th century, Ilkhanate rulers were Muslim, and the administration had absorbed many elements of Persian Islamic governance. But the Mongol conquest had disrupted so much of the existing institutional structure that the society that emerged was different in fundamental ways from what had existed before. The old Abbasid system was gone. The urban networks of Persia and Mesopotamia were damaged. The new political order was built on Mongol military power, adapted to the needs of governing sedentary populations. The cultural and intellectual consequences of this division were significant. Islamic scholarship, philosophy, and science continued to flourish in Mamluk territories with relatively little interruption. The great historians, jurists, and theologians of the late medieval Islamic world often worked under Mamluk patronage or in Mamluk-controlled cities. The Mongol territories, meanwhile, underwent a period of disruption and reorganization that reoriented much of Persian culture toward different influences and priorities. The Persian literary renaissance that flowered in the 14th and 15th centuries emerged from this post-Mongol context, blending Islamic, Persian, and Central Asian elements in new ways. The economic consequences were equally profound. The Mongol conquests had disrupted the trade networks that connected the Islamic world to Central Asia and China. The old Silk Road routes that had brought goods and wealth from East Asia to the Mediterranean were damaged by warfare and instability. The Mamluk control of Egypt and the Levant preserved alternative trade routes through the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, maintaining commercial connections between Europe, the Islamic world, and the Indian Ocean. Cairo and Damascus became major commercial hubs, enriching the Mamluk state and funding the military apparatus that protected these networks. But the preservation of these trade routes also created vulnerabilities. When the Portuguese opened direct maritime routes to India and East Asia in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, bypassing the Middle East entirely, the economic foundation of Mamluk power was undermined. The customs revenue from overland and Red Sea trade declined. The Mamluk state, dependent on this revenue to fund its military, faced increasing financial strain. This economic pressure contributed to the internal weaknesses that made the Mamluks vulnerable to Ottoman conquest in the early 16th century. The technological dimension of Mamluk decline reveals another consequence of their earlier success. The military system that defeated the Mongols was optimized for cavalry warfare using composite bows, sabers, and traditional siege equipment. This system worked brilliantly in the 13th and 14th centuries, when cavalry mobility and archery skill were decisive. But as gunpowder weapons became more effective in the 15th century, the Mamluk system struggled to adapt. The Ottomans embraced gunpowder technology, developing effective artillery and musket-armed infantry. The combination of cannon fire and disciplined infantry formations proved devastating against traditional cavalry charges. At the Battle of Majd-Dabik in 1516, Mamluk heavy cavalry charged Ottoman positions repeatedly and were shattered by artillery and musket fire. The Mamluks fought with traditional courage and skill, but courage and skill were not enough against an opponent with technological advantages and tactics designed to exploit them. The sixth lesson is that strategic success requires matching military capability to political objectives. The Mamluks did not try to conquer the Mongol Ilkhanate or destroy Mongol power entirely. They recognized that this was beyond their capabilities. Their objective was narrower: to defend Egypt and Syria, to deter Mongol invasion, and to establish a defensible frontier. This limited objective was achievable with the resources and capabilities they possessed. By focusing on what was possible rather than pursuing unrealistic ambitions, they achieved a sustainable strategic outcome. The Mongols, by contrast, pursued unlimited expansion for decades, conquering everything they could reach. This strategy worked as long as they faced opponents who could not resist effectively, but it also meant they were fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, dispersing their forces across a vast empire and facing the logistical challenges of governing territories that did not fit their traditional social and economic model. The decision to accept the frontier with the Mamluks, rather than committing overwhelming force to conquer Egypt, was a rational recognition of these constraints. The seventh lesson is that defense can be as strategically valuable as offense. The Mamluks are remembered for their victory at Jalut, but their greater achievement was the 2.5 centuries of regional dominance that followed. They did not build this dominance through constant conquest. They built it through successful defense of their core territories, systematic elimination of weaker threats, and the maintenance of a military system that deterred stronger opponents. This defensive posture was not passive. It required constant vigilance, regular campaigns, and the willingness to fight when necessary. But it was fundamentally about preservation rather than expansion. This defensive strategic orientation is often undervalued in military history, which tends to celebrate conquest and expansion. But preservation of what you have is often more difficult and more valuable than acquiring more. The Mamluks understood this, and they built a military system designed for sustainable defense rather than unlimited expansion. The final lesson is that historical outcomes are contingent, not inevitable. The Mamluks won at Jalut, but they could have lost. The Mongols failed to conquer Egypt, but under different circumstances they might have succeeded. History is shaped by the decisions people make, the systems they build, and the circumstances they face. Understanding how these factors interacted to produce the outcomes we observe is more valuable than constructing deterministic narratives where everything had to happen the way it did. The Mamluks succeeded because they made good strategic decisions, built effective institutions, and fought competently under favourable circumstances. They also benefited from Mongol internal divisions, extended Mongol supply lines, and terrain that reduced Mongol advantages. Change any of these factors significantly, and the outcome might have been different. The fact that they succeeded does not mean success was inevitable. It means they created conditions where success was possible, and then executed effectively when the opportunity came. The broader historical significance of Jalut and the Mamluk-Mongol conflict lies not just in what happened, but in what it reveals about the nature of power, the possibilities of resistance, and the relationship between military systems and the societies they emerge from. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century represented one of the great discontinuities in world history, a period when established political orders collapsed, ancient empires disappeared, and the geographic and cultural map of Eurasia was redrawn through systematic military violence. The Mamluk success in halting this expansion at the western edge demonstrates that even the most dominant military systems have limits, and that those limits can be identified and exploited by opponents with the resources and discipline to do so. The Islamic world that survived into the 14th and 15th centuries was profoundly shaped by this confrontation. Without the Mamluk victory, Egypt and the Levant would likely have undergone the same catastrophic destruction, that devastated Persia and Mesopotamia. The continuity of Islamic institutions, the preservation of urban centres like Cairo and Damascus, and the maintenance of trade networks that connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean all depended on the Mamluks' ability to establish and hold a defensive frontier. This was not just a military achievement, it was a civilizational one, preserving the conditions under which scholarship, commerce, and cultural production could continue. The cost of this preservation, measured in the lives of the enslaved children who were transformed into Mamluk soldiers, in the brutal campaigns against Crusader cities, in the heavy taxation of Egyptian peasants, and in the authoritarian nature of Mamluk rule, was enormous. The Mamluk state was not a benevolent or enlightened regime. It was a military dictatorship that subordinated every other priority to the maintenance of armed force. But the alternative, based on what the Mongol conquests had already demonstrated elsewhere, would almost certainly have been worse for the millions of people who lived under Mamluk protection. This tension between the moral costs of military power and the consequences of military defeat runs through all of history. Societies facing existential threats must make terrible choices about what they are willing to sacrifice, what methods they are willing to employ, and what kind of state they are willing to create in order to survive. The Mamluks made those choices, built a system optimized for military effectiveness regardless of other costs, and succeeded in their primary objective. Whether this success justified the methods is a question that cannot be answered definitively, because we cannot know what would have happened under different choices. We only know what did happen and what the historical record tells us about the likely alternatives. The legacy of the Mamluk military system extended beyond their own state and era. The model of professional slave soldiers, trained from childhood for military service and bound by loyalty to the institution, rather than to tribe or dynasty, influenced other Islamic military systems. The Ottomans adopted elements of this model in their Janissary corps, though they recruited through forced levy of Christian boys rather than through slave markets. The Safavids in Persia used slave soldiers from the Caucasus in their military forces. The concept that military effectiveness could be enhanced by creating a separate military class with no competing loyalties became embedded in Islamic military thought. But the Mamluk model also demonstrated the vulnerabilities of such systems. A military caste with no connection to the broader society it defended, no dynastic legitimacy, and no basis for authority except force, inevitably faced challenges of succession, internal competition, and eventual obsolescence when military conditions changed. The Mamluks survived these challenges longer than most such regimes, but they did not escape them. Their final defeat by the Ottomans was not just a military failure, but a systemic collapse, as a military model optimized for one kind of warfare proved unable to adapt to new technologies and tactics. The Mongol Empire, meanwhile, underwent its own transformation after the Western expansion was halted. The Ilkhanate converted to Islam, adopted Persian administrative practices, and became a regional power that patronized culture and learning, rather than simply conquering and destroying. The other Mongol Khanates followed similar trajectories, blending Mongol military traditions with local cultures and governing systems. By the 14th century, the Mongol Empire was no longer a unified entity pursuing unlimited conquest. It was a collection of regional states that happened to share Mongol origins and certain cultural elements, but pursued independent and often conflicting objectives. This transformation was not driven primarily by military defeat. The Mongols lost at Jalut, but they won far more battles than they lost, and they established lasting control over most of the territories they conquered. The transformation was driven by the internal dynamics of governing vast sedentary populations, by succession disputes and fragmentation of authority, and by the gradual integration of Mongol rulers into the societies they governed. But the defeat at Ain Jalut and the failure to conquer Egypt marked a symbolic turning point, demonstrating that the era of unlimited Mongol expansion was over, and that the future would be defined by consolidation and adaptation rather than endless conquest. The strategic lesson that resonates across the centuries is that military dominance is always temporary and always contextual. The Mongols dominated because their military system was optimized for certain kinds of warfare, and because most of their opponents were unprepared to counter their methods effectively. When they met an opponent who understood their system, who built capabilities specifically designed to neutralize their advantages, and who operated under conditions that favored defense over offense, their dominance ended. This does not diminish what the Mongols achieved. It simply places their achievements in proper perspective as the product of specific advantages operating under specific conditions rather than as manifestations of inherent superiority. The Mamluks, in turn, dominated their region for 2.5 centuries because their military system was effective for cavalry warfare in the pre-gunpowder era, and because they maintained the institutional mechanisms necessary to sustain that system over time. When warfare evolved and their system could not adapt quickly enough, their dominance ended as well. Every military system eventually encounters this limit, and understanding why and how these transitions occur is more valuable than celebrating past victories or lamenting past defeats. For modern observers, the story of Jalut and the Mamluk-Mongol conflict offers several insights. First, that preparation and institutional strength matter more than improvisation and individual heroism in sustained military competition. Second, that logistics and sustainability determine the boundaries of what is operationally possible, regardless of tactical brilliance. Third, that even the most successful military systems have vulnerabilities that can be identified and exploited by opponents willing to invest the resources and effort necessary to do so. Fourth, that adaptation is essential for long-term survival, but is often resisted by institutions whose power and identity are bound up with existing methods. And fifth, that the moral costs of military effectiveness are real and must be weighed against the consequences of defeat, even though this calculation can never produce simple or comfortable answers. The Mongols were not invincible, the Mamluks were not virtuous heroes. What happened at Jalut was the collision of two professional military systems under conditions that favoured one over the other, and the victory went to the side that had prepared more systematically for exactly these conditions. The centuries that followed demonstrated both the value of that victory in preserving a civilization and the limits of the system that achieved it. Military power secured survival but could not guarantee permanent security. Institutional strength enabled long-term effectiveness, but also created rigidities that proved fatal when circumstances changed. This is the grounded, realistic lesson of Jalut, that military outcomes are determined by preparation, logistics, institutional strength, and the fit between capabilities and operational conditions. That dominance is contextual and temporary. That adaptation is necessary but difficult, and that the preservation of societies often depends on military systems that are effective but not morally pure, that succeed through discipline and structure rather than through inspiration or virtue, and that eventually must either adapt or be replaced when the conditions that made them effective change. The Mamluks stopped the Mongols not because they were destined to, not because divine intervention saved them, and not because they possessed some secret advantage that others lacked. They stopped the Mongols because they built a military system designed to counter Mongol operational methods, because they maintained that system through disciplined institutional mechanisms, because they fought under conditions that minimized Mongol advantages, and because they executed their tactical doctrine effectively when the decisive moment came. That is the lesson, stripped of mythology and sentimentality. Preparation, discipline, logistics, and institutional strength determine outcomes when professional military systems collide. Everything else is detail and circumstance.